Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Arcane Paradox, presenting to you today, what if all four founders' artifacts chose Harry at once and Britain demanded Dumbledore arrested now? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Choosing the Sorting Hat smelled like old libraries and something older than libraries, like the inside of a clock that had been running since before anyone alive could remember. Harry knew this because it was sitting on his head, and he was 11 years old, and the entire Great Hall of Hogwarts was watching him with the kind of silence that had weight to it. He'd been nervous walking up. He'd watched the hat shout house names for 20 minutes, watched kids either beam or go pale at the announcement, watched the tables erupt in cheering that bounced off the enchanted ceiling and came back down like weather. He'd told himself it would be quick. Walk up, sit down, 30 seconds, done. The hat had been on his head for 2 full minutes now. Nobody was cheering. "You are a problem," the hat said, inside his skull, in a voice that sounded like rustling parchment and felt like someone pressing a thumb gently against the inside of his forehead. "In the best possible way. I haven't had a problem like you in 1,000 years. Harry kept very still. "Can you just pick one?" "I could. The question is whether I should." There was a pause, and in the pause Harry got the strangest impression, not a thought exactly, more like a sensation, like standing at the center of a vast spoked wheel and feeling all the spokes at once. Gryffindor would take you for the courage that lives in your bones. Slytherin would take you for the ambition you don't know you have yet. Ravenclaw sees the mind that's been starving for decent books its entire life. Hufflepuff knows what it cost you to get here, the work and the patience and the loyalty that kept you alive through things that should have broken you. So pick the one that fits best. "That's just it, Mr. Potter." The hat sounded almost amused. "They all fit. Not partially. Not with reservations. Completely. I have sorted 11,412 students in my existence. I have never once encountered a soul that every founder would have wanted equally and without compromise." Another pause. Something in the castle shifted, a vibration so low it wasn't sound, just pressure. Until now. Harry felt it before he understood it. A warmth that started at the crown of his head where the hat sat and spread downward through his shoulders, his chest, his hands. Not uncomfortable. The opposite of uncomfortable. Like stepping out of cold wind into a room with a fire. "Oh," said the hat, very quietly. "Oh, they're waking up." Then the sword fell. Not fell, flew. From somewhere up on the wall behind the staff table, a sword in a glass case simply ceased to care about the glass and the wall and gravity, and it crossed the great hall in a long clean arc that made every student lean away from it simultaneously, and it landed point first in the stone floor 3 feet from Harry's stool with a ringing note that Harry felt in his back teeth. The great hall erupted. Not in cheering. In confusion and alarm, chairs scraping, professors standing, several first-years grabbing each other's arms. Professor McGonagall was on her feet with her wand out before the sword had finished vibrating. Dumbledore rose slowly from the headmaster's chair, his expression doing something complicated that Harry, facing the staff table, couldn't quite read. Then the cup appeared. It came from somewhere in the castle, Harry didn't see where, but every head turned toward the doors at the far end of the hall as something gold and glowing floated through them at shoulder height. Hufflepuff's cup, though Harry wouldn't know that name until later. What he knew in that moment was that it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen and that it was moving toward him with the certainty of water moving downhill. It settled onto the arm of the stool beside his elbow, and the golden light it threw turned Harry's skin warm. The great hall had gone absolutely quiet again. The different kind of quiet, not the waiting for a name quiet of the sorting, but the quiet of a room full of people who have just witnessed something they have no category for. The diadem came last. Nobody saw where it came from. One moment it wasn't there. The next it was descending through the air above Harry's head with the slow inevitability of a crown, and the sorting hat, apparently with its own set of priorities, leaned to one side so the diadem could settle on Harry's brow just below the brim. The warmth became light. Not blinding, nothing that dramatic. Just a quiet, gold-and-silver radiance that pulsed once from where Harry sat, rolled outward across the stone floor like a tide, and was gone. The hat spoke aloud then. Not inside Harry's head. Aloud, in a voice that carried to the rafters and bounced back, changed, larger, like the castle itself was amplifying it. "There is no sorting to be done tonight," it announced. "He is claimed by all four. The founders have named their heir." Complete and total silence. Then every candle in the great hall flared white. Harry took the hat off his own head. Nobody had told him to, he just did it, because sitting under all of that with a hat on felt strange, and the diadem was already doing fine on its own. He set the hat carefully on the stool beside him, looked at the sword in the floor, looked at the cup on the stool's arm, felt the diadem cool and steady at his brow. He turned to face the staff table. Dumbledore was watching him with an expression that looked like wonder and something else, something tightly leashed beneath the wonder, something that moved quickly behind those half-moon glasses before the wonder settled back over it. He stepped down from behind the staff table with his hands clasped and his silver beard catching the candlelight, and the murmur that had begun to rebuild through the student body went quiet again at his movement. "Harry," he said. Warmly. Like a grandfather approaching a child who'd done something marvelous. "Perhaps you'd like to sit down, where?" Harry asked. It wasn't rude. It was a genuine question. He had no house. The 4 house tables stretched out behind him, and he didn't belong to any of them, and belonging to all of them was functionally the same thing. Dumbledore smiled. "We'll sort out the details," the hat said. "There's nothing to sort out." Harry picked up Hufflepuff's cup from the stool's arm. It warmed in his hand immediately, like a living thing. He looked at it, then back at Dumbledore. "Doesn't that mean something? With these things? Aren't there rules about this?" The something behind Dumbledore's eyes moved again. "There are many old protocols that, Headmaster." Professor McGonagall's voice came from the side of the staff table, low and careful. "The charter. The founders wrote a charter." "Minerva, the founders wrote a charter," she said again, and this time it wasn't careful at all. She was looking at Harry with an expression that was rapidly cycling through about 4 different emotions, and it settled on something that looked like she was seeing a ghost, but not a frightening kind. The kind you'd given up hoping for. Article 7. If ever an heir of the 4 was named by the artifacts themselves, that individual would hold. The details of the charter can be discussed in a more appropriate setting. Dumbledore's voice was still warm, still grandfatherly, still absolutely pleasant in every syllable, but the warmth had structure under it now, like rebar in concrete. Harry watched him. He wasn't afraid. He noticed that he wasn't afraid, which was interesting, because he'd been afraid of plenty of things in his life and this was objectively one of the stranger moments of it, but the diadem on his brow felt like clarity, like the particular focus that comes when you finally understood something that's been blurry for a long time. "I'd like to hear what Article 7 says," Harry said. Dumbledore's smile did not waver. "Of course. And you will. Tonight has been, quite unexpected, even for this old castle. What matters now is that you find your feet, meet your new friends." His gaze moved, almost imperceptibly, to the 4 house tables, encompassing them, redirecting the conversation's momentum with the ease of long practice. "Perhaps you might sit with the Gryffindors for tonight, Harry. We can discuss the remarkable events of the evening tomorrow, when we've all had time to." He should sit at his own table. The voice came from the Gryffindor table. Every head turned. A girl Harry's age, bushy brown hair, slightly out of breath, as though she'd just completed a very rapid internal calculation, was standing up. Even sitting nearby, Hermione Granger had the expression of someone who has just opened a book they expected to be interesting and found it to be the most important thing they'd ever read. "There's a 5th table," she said, and she pointed. There wasn't. Or there hadn't been. But the stone floor between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables was cracking, very gently, very deliberately, and something was rising from it, or rather, something was being offered by the floor, the way a hand extends something precious, a round table, ancient stone, carved with interlocking motifs from all four houses that tangled together at the center into something that wasn't any house symbol at all, but something older. Harry looked at it. He walked over to it and sat down. The great hall, students, professors, ghosts hovering near the ceiling, and the poltergeist Peeves who had frozen mid-mischief near the candelabra, stared at the 11-year-old boy sitting alone at a round stone table with a glowing cup, an ancient sword still ringing in the floor, and a diadem on his head, eating absolutely nothing because no one had thought to put food there yet. Harry looked at the nearest platter, which was technically the Gryffindor table, and said, "Can someone pass the chicken?" Ron Weasley handed it over without thinking, and then appeared surprised at himself. Hermione sat down across from Harry at the round table, also without appearing to have planned it, as though her body had made the decision and simply informed her afterward. She set her hands on the stone surface and said, "The Founders' Charter of 980 AD. I read about it in Hogwarts, a history. Article 7 is only 2 sentences long, but nobody's ever taken it seriously because everyone assumed it was theoretical. Like a constitutional clause that couldn't actually be triggered." "What does it say?" Harry asked, pulling a leg off the chicken. "It says," she paused, clearly reciting from memory, "should all 4 artifacts acknowledge a single heir, that individual shall hold sovereign stewardship over the school and its traditions, equal in authority to the founders themselves in all matters pertaining to the castle and its governance, and no external authority may supersede this claim while the heir lives." Harry ate a bite of chicken. He chewed. He swallowed. "Sovereign stewardship," he said. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Hermione said, "that Dumbledore can't tell you what to do." She said it quietly. She said it with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of words and had selected those particular ones deliberately. Ron had materialized at the table at some point, plate in hand, with the confidence of someone who decided that proximity to interesting things was always the right move. "It means Dumbledore can't tell him what to do," Ron repeated, tasting the idea. "Blimey. It's more complicated than that," Hermione said. "It would need to be verified, tested, the Wisengamot would need to see the original charter." "Is the original charter in the school?" Harry asked. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Yes. It's supposed to be in the headmaster's office. Which technically, Ron started. "Is mine," Harry said. Not with satisfaction. Not with arrogance. Just noting a fact. He looked down at the diadem, which he could feel more than see, and had the distinct impression that if he were wearing the right kind of spectacles he'd be able to read the words off its surface, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." He understood, in a way he couldn't have articulated, that the diadem wasn't simply an artifact. It was an amplifier. It took whatever was already in him and turned the volume up. What was already in him, apparently, was a deep and instinctive understanding of when adults were trying to manage him. He'd grown up in a house where adults managed him as an art form, and he recognized the shape of it, the warmth, the redirection, the pleasant postponement of any conversation that might give him actual information. He looked across the great hall to where Dumbledore had returned to his seat at the staff table and was speaking quietly to Professor McGonagall with every appearance of calm. McGonagall, Harry noticed, was not responding with calm. She was responding with the specific stillness of someone holding themselves very carefully in check. "He's going to try to get these back," Harry said. "Yes," Hermione said. "How do I stop that?" She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she would look at problems for the rest of her life, like they were things to be understood and therefore solved. "First, you don't let them out of your sight. Second, we find that charter before he has a chance to." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say. "Before he has a chance to do anything with it." "You think he'd hide it?" Ron said. "Dumbledore? The headmaster?" "I think," Hermione said carefully, "that very powerful people with genuinely good intentions are sometimes the most dangerous kind, because they always have a reason." The sorting continued around them in a daze, the remaining first years going through the hat in a blur of tradition that felt slightly absurd after what had preceded it. Harry ate his dinner. People stared. He let them. Neville Longbottom, sorted into Gryffindor and still looking vaguely shocked by his own existence, had drifted to the edge of the round table and was standing there holding a bread roll with the expression of someone who had something to say and couldn't decide whether to say it. Harry looked at him. "You can sit down," Harry said. Neville sat down. He put his bread roll on the table and stared at the sword of Gryffindor, still upright in the floor. "It's not going to fall over?" he asked. "Doesn't feel like it," Harry said. "My gran's going to hear about tonight," Neville said. "Not proudly. More the way you talk about incoming weather." "Most people's grans probably will," Ron said. "My gran's on the Wisengamot." Neville pulled at his bread roll. "She wrote to Dumbledore 3 times before I even started here, asking about the old charters. He wrote back very politely and said they were historical curiosities." He looked at the diadem on Harry's forehead, then quickly away. She's going to have opinions." "About what?" Harry asked. "About the fact that the thing Dumbledore called a historical curiosity just put itself on your head," Neville said. Harry considered this. Good opinions or bad opinions? Neville looked down at his bread roll and smiled, very briefly, like he was trying to hide it. "About you? She'll think it's brilliant." "About Dumbledore calling things historical curiosities?" He tore his bread in half. "Oh, she's going to be furious." The headmaster's office was reached by a gargoyle staircase, which presumably required the password, but Harry found when he walked up to the gargoyle that evening, alone, having told Hermione and Ron that this was something he needed to do himself, and having told his dormitory prefect Percy Weasley that he'd be along shortly in a tone that did not leave room for Percy to follow up, that the gargoyle simply stepped aside. The staircase rose. The door at the top opened. He'd expected Dumbledore to be there. He wasn't. The office was empty except for the portraits of previous headmasters, all of whom were either asleep or pretending to be, and Fawkes the Phoenix on his perch, who was awake and watching Harry with liquid amber eyes. The room was extraordinary, cluttered in the way that spoke of decades of accumulation, instruments that spun and puffed silver smoke, shelves dense with books and oddities, the general texture of a very brilliant mind that had been resident in one place for a very long time. Harry moved through it without touching anything, following something that he didn't have a name for, the diadem's influence again, or something deeper, something that recognized the room. The charter was in a locked cabinet behind a portrait of a sleeping headmaster. Not a high-security lock. A lock that said "I don't expect anyone to look here because no one should know to look here." Harry put his hand on the cabinet door, and the lock clicked open on its own, and he wondered, briefly, whether this was how it was going to be now, magic recognizing him before he asked it to. He took the charter out. It was a single piece of parchment, impossibly preserved, covered in 4 different sets of handwriting that had been written simultaneously, because the letters from all 4 writers overlapped and intertwined in a way that should have been illegible but wasn't. He read Article 7. It said what Hermione had said. Almost word for word, which told him she'd memorized it from a book that had quoted it accurately. He rolled the charter back up and put it inside his robes. Fawkes made a sound, not quite a song, something shorter, more private. An acknowledgement. "I don't want to run anything," Harry told the Phoenix. He wasn't sure why he said it. It was just true. "I don't want to sit in this office or give people orders. I just want," he stopped. What did he want? Not to be managed. Not to be pointed and aimed at things. Not to be the weapon in someone else's plan that Hermione's tone earlier in the evening had suggested Dumbledore had been building. "I want it to be fair," he said finally. "Whatever happens. I want it to be fair." Fawkes sang one note, then, and it went through Harry's chest like a key turning in a lock that had been frozen stiff for 11 years. He went back downstairs and to bed, where he lay awake for a long time staring at the canopy with the diadem sitting on the bedside table glowing softly in the dark, and the distant feeling that somewhere in the castle below him, in offices and common rooms and via fireplace and owl, adults were already talking very fast. Dumbledore was in the great hall before breakfast, ostensibly directing some repairs to the stone floor around the sword, which had, overnight, become fixed, permanently and immovably, in the center of the round stone table as though it had always been there. The moment Harry walked in, Dumbledore turned and smiled at him with the full force of the warmth that Harry was now watching like a man watching weather on the horizon. "Good morning, Harry. I trust you slept well. Rather a lot to process, I imagine." "It was fine," Harry said. He sat at the round table. The cup was where he'd left it. The sword sat in the stone. The diadem, he'd chosen to wear again this morning, because it helped him think and he expected he'd need to. Dumbledore drew a chair over and sat across from him. "I was hoping we might have a conversation." "Sure." The events of last night were, a small pause, a gentle search for words that was itself a form of performance, extraordinary. The artifacts have not all moved since the founding of the school. What happened was unprecedented, and I want you to understand that I hold it in the deepest respect. He folded his hands on the table. "I also want you to understand, Harry, that with something so unprecedented comes great responsibility, not just for you, but for all of us to ensure it is handled wisely. Some very old laws were written in very different times, and applying them literally to the modern world can cause confusion. Division. What would you like to do with the charter?" Harry asked. Dumbledore's eyes, behind their half-moon glasses, did the thing again, the quick movement, the settling. "I think it might be wise to have it reviewed by our legal scholars, to understand its true intent." "I have it," Harry said. A beat of silence. Very quiet. The great hall was filling behind them, students filing in for breakfast, the noise level rising, but the small circle around Harry's table had a different quality of air. "I'm sorry," Dumbledore said. "The charter. I went and got it last night." Harry held Dumbledore's gaze calmly. "The gargoyle let me in." Something moved across Dumbledore's face, too fast to name, too controlled to be accidental. He was extraordinary at this, Harry thought. At keeping his face a room where only invited guests arrived. "I see. And may I ask?" "It's mine," Harry said, simply. Article 7. I hold sovereign stewardship of the school and its traditions. The charter is a school document. He pulled it from his robes and set it on the table between them. Dumbledore looked at it. Looked at Harry. "You are 11 years old," he said, and his voice was very gentle. "Yes," Harry said. "The responsibilities implied by this document." "I'm not going to run the school," Harry said. "I'm not an idiot. You run the school. I'm going to go to classes and do my homework and probably break some rules by accident because that seems like what happens here." He saw something shift in Dumbledore's posture, the faint, almost imperceptible relaxation of someone who thinks a resolution is approaching. Harry continued. "But I'm not going to give the charter to someone for safekeeping and stop asking questions about it, if that's where this conversation was going." The relaxation stopped. "That's not," Dumbledore began. "What were you going to do with me?" Harry asked. "I mean, before last night. You had a plan. Everyone who knew I was coming had a plan. I could feel it in the letters, in the way Hagrid talked about things, in the way you looked at me last night right before you tried to send me to sit with the Gryffindors." He wasn't angry. He was genuinely curious. What was the plan? The great hall was full now. Hundreds of students eating breakfast, occasionally glancing over with badly concealed curiosity. The staff table was filling with professors, several of whom were watching the round table with focused attention. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the layer of performance. What remained underneath was real, and it was complicated, and to Harry's credit he recognized both things. "I wanted to keep you safe," Dumbledore said. "You are remarkable, Harry. You have been remarkable since the night you survived the curse that killed your parents. And remarkable things attract dangerous attention. So you were going to keep it quiet. I was going to keep you quiet. He said it with the dignity of a man who has said hard true things before and knows how to give you time to grow, to learn, to understand what you carry. Let the world's attention rest elsewhere while you became ready. Ready for what? Dumbledore didn't answer that. Harry looked at him for a long moment. At the extraordinary old man sitting across the table from him with his hands folded and his eyes full of something that was absolutely genuine care and absolutely genuine intention to steer, to point, to aim, to use, no matter how kindly. I believe you, Harry said at last. That you want to keep me safe. I genuinely do. He put his hand on the charter without picking it up. But I'm not going to pretend the artifacts didn't do what they did because it's inconvenient. I'm not going to sit quietly in a corner until someone decides I'm ready. He met Dumbledore's eyes directly. If the Founders chose me, then I'll figure out what that means as I go. I'd rather do it with your help. But I'll do it either way. The great hall was full of breakfast sounds, spoons on bowls, toast crunching, someone at the Ravenclaw table accidentally summoning their orange juice too hard and splashing their robes. The ordinary river of morning running around the extraordinary stillness at the round table. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter, this small, thin, bespectacled boy with an ancient diadem at his brow and a sword at his elbow and an 11-year-old's complete, unselfish certainty, and smiled, and this time the smile was different. Still complex. But smaller. Less performance. More man. I think, Dumbledore said, that the next 7 years are going to be unlike anything I planned for. Probably, Harry agreed. I hope you will allow an old man to advise you, even if you won't allow him to manage you. I'd actually really like that, Harry said honestly. I don't know anything yet. I just know I'm going to figure it out. Dumbledore rose, nodded once, and it was a different kind of nod than he gave anyone else, Harry noticed. It had respect in it. Maybe not entirely voluntary, but genuine. He went back to the staff table. Hermione and Ron arrived at the round table with their plates, Hermione's expression indicating she'd been waiting an agonizing 30 seconds to hear how it had gone. Neville appeared a moment later with his porridge. The sword of Gryffindor caught the morning light and threw it across the stone ceiling. Well? Hermione said. We had a conversation, Harry said. And? I think we understand each other. He reached for the toast. For now. For now, she repeated, reading volumes into the qualifier. And the charter? He tapped his robes where it sat inside. Right here. She let out a breath. Then she opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Harry, when word of last night gets out, properly gets out, not just student gossip, the ministry is going to, I know. And the press, I know. And Dumbledore, regardless of this morning, Hermione, Harry said. She stopped. He looked at her, and at Ron, and at Neville eating his porridge with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has decided to be exactly where he is. I know, Harry said. All of it. But right now it's breakfast, and I've been in the magical world for 4 days, and I'd quite like to eat my toast before the world catches up. Ron held up his cup of pumpkin juice. I'll drink to that. Hermione picked up her fork. Outside the enchanted ceiling, clouds moved across the Scottish sky, and far below the castle, in the village of Hogsmeade, an owl was already winging south toward London with a letter that would reach a reporter's desk by mid-morning, and on the letter were words like impossible and founders and heir, and the reporter's name was Rita Skeeter, and she was already awake. But that was later. That was tomorrow's storm. Right now the toast was warm and the diadem caught the light and the sword sat solid and sure in the stone table, and Harry Potter ate his breakfast and did not hide from anyone at all. Chapter 2, The weight of 3 days into term, Harry Potter had developed a reputation. Not the reputation he'd arrived with, the boy who lived one, the lightning bolt scar one, the whispered name in corridors one. That reputation was old and secondhand, built from a story that other people had told about him before he was old enough to understand it. This was different. This one was his, and it had been built in 72 hours by nothing more dramatic than the way he moved through the castle. He walked like he knew where he was going. That was most of it, actually. He'd been exploring since 5 in the morning of his first full day, before anyone else was awake, with the diadem on his brow and the charter in his robes and the distinct feeling that the castle was introducing itself to him, a creak here, a warm spot in the stone there, a corridor that rearranged itself not to confuse him but to show him something he hadn't seen yet. He'd learned Hogwarts faster than any first year in memory, and when a third-year Ravenclaw tried to give him wrong directions to Transfiguration as a joke, Harry had thanked her politely and arrived 4 minutes early. The diadem helped. He understood that now with more clarity than he'd had on the first night. It didn't give him knowledge, it sharpened what was already there, the way a whetstone doesn't make a blade, only brings out the edge. Every lesson landed faster. Every connection between ideas clicked into place with the certainty of tumblers in a lock. In charms, he'd cast Wingardium Leviosa on his first try without really thinking about it, the feather lifting as though it was relieved to have somewhere to go. Professor Flitwick had made a small squeaking sound and written something rapidly in his notes. In Transfiguration, McGonagall had watched him turn a match into a needle in 90 seconds, perfectly tapered, perfectly sharp, with the head fully formed, and then watched him do it again without being asked, left-handed, while she was explaining the theory to the rest of the class. She hadn't said anything except to give him 4 points for, and then she'd stopped, because he didn't have a house, and the point system was house-based, and the whole structure of Hogwarts academic reward had no category for him. She'd given him 4 points anyway and not specified which house, which meant the hourglasses at the front entrance didn't respond at all, and the prefects had argued about it for 20 minutes at dinner. The sword of Gryffindor stayed at the round table in the Great Hall. Nobody moved it, because nobody could. Neville had attempted it one morning on a dare from Seamus Finnegan and the sword had simply declined to come free, not with any drama, just with the straightforward finality of a door that was locked. The cup sat beside Harry's plate at meals, warm and golden, and people had stopped staring at it after the second day the way people stop staring at any extraordinary thing once it becomes part of the furniture. The diadem Harry wore to lessons, because it fit under his hat and it helped him think, and if people found that strange they'd had enough strange already this week to have exhausted their capacity for surprise. What they hadn't exhausted, Harry was finding, was their capacity for feeling things about him. It was Thursday afternoon, double potions in the dungeons, when the first real test came. Snape's classroom was cold in a way that went past the physical temperature, a deliberate cold, the kind that lived in the professor's expression and radiated outward to chill the air into compliance. Harry had heard about Snape from Ron on the first evening, the general mythology of him, though Ron's version was mostly dramatic summary delivered between bites of chicken. What Harry saw when he walked into the dungeon classroom was a tall man in black who moved with the precise economy of someone who had learned that stillness is a weapon. Snape took the register. He paused at Harry's name. Not long, perhaps a half-second longer than everyone else's, and then he looked up, and the look was the most complicated single expression Harry had encountered since arriving at Hogwarts. It wasn't hate. Harry had grown up in a house with the genuine article and he knew what it felt like. This was, older. Layered. Something that had been turning over in the dark for years and hadn't quite resolved into a single thing. Potter, Snape said. Professor, Harry said. Snape's eyes went to the diadem, just briefly. Something flickered behind his expression and was swallowed. He moved on to the next name. The lesson was on the properties of potions' ingredients, theory rather than practical, which Harry found interesting in the straightforward way he found everything interesting when he was actually being taught something instead of being left alone in a room with a broken television. He took careful notes. He answered 2 questions, one about the properties of bezoars, one about the difference between a potion and a draught, and both times he was correct, and both times Snape's response was to acknowledge the answer without acknowledgement, which was its own kind of technique. Halfway through the lesson, Snape stopped pacing. Potter. He turned to face Harry across 3 rows of students. Tell me, since you clearly have opinions about curriculum, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? The class went still. The question had a specific quality to it, not a teaching question, but a testing question, the kind designed to find the ceiling. The diadem was quiet on his brow. Harry didn't need it for this one. He'd read magical drafts and potions twice on the train, because there'd been nothing else to do and it was interesting. Draft of Living Death, he said. One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. Asphodel is in the lily family, and wormwood is from Artemisia. The combination produces a soporific effect that's qualitatively different from standard sleeping drafts because it slows the heartbeat to near-death levels rather than just inducing unconsciousness. A beat. The lily family detail isn't in the textbook, Snape said. No, I looked it up separately. Harry held his professor's gaze without any challenge in it, just the directness of someone who isn't carrying anything to hide. I was curious about the etymology. Asphodel's named for the flower in the Asphodel Meadows, the part of the underworld where ordinary souls go. Wormwood shows up in Revelation as the name of a star that poisons water. I thought the naming was interesting, given what the potion does. The silence in the classroom was a different texture now. Snape was watching him with something that had moved past the complicated layered thing and arrived at simple, reluctant attention. 5 points, he said quietly, and turned back to the board. Ron, sitting beside Harry, exhaled silently. Later, in the corridor, he said, I have never in my life heard Snape give points to anyone who wasn't in Slytherin. He didn't give them to a house, Hermione pointed out. He gave them to Harry. Same as McGonagall, Ron said. They're just, giving him points directly. Like he's his own house. Harry considered that. Is that a problem? No, Ron said immediately. It's historically unprecedented, Hermione said, which for her was a form of enthusiasm. The point system hasn't been modified since 1843. You're creating case law in real time. I just answered a question, Harry said. You just answered a question while wearing an artifact that makes Snape forget to be intimidating, she corrected. That is absolutely not the same thing. The letter from the ministry arrived on Friday morning. Harry saw the owl first, official ministry post, the heavy sealed kind, grey and humorless, dropping onto the staff table and landing in front of Dumbledore with the particular weight of official correspondence that has opinions about itself. He watched Dumbledore open it, read it, and set it down with the precise care of someone placing a chess piece. Hermione had noticed too. She was watching over the top of her porridge bowl. That's a ministry seal, she murmured. I saw. They're fast. It's only been 3 days. Word got out, Harry said. Which was inevitable, and he'd known it was inevitable, and he'd made his peace with that before he finished his first breakfast. The Sorting Hat's declaration in front of 300 students wasn't a secret you kept, no matter how firmly Dumbledore might prefer it. McGonagall appeared at the round table 10 minutes later. She stood with her hands folded and her expression doing the controlled emotion thing that Harry was beginning to recognize as her version of Dumbledore's warmth, not a performance, but a discipline. The ministry has sent an official inquiry, she said. They want a full report on the events of Monday evening, a census of the artifacts and their current location, and, she paused, a meeting with you. With me specifically? With the individual identified as the founder's heir, yes. Her voice was perfectly level. Cornelius Fudge signed the letter personally. Harry ate a bite of egg. When? They've suggested next Wednesday. Here at the school. Her eyes moved briefly to the diadem. Harry, the ministry's interest in this will not be benign. Fudge he is not a cruel man, but he is a frightened one, and frightened men with political power are, unpredictable, Harry said. I was going to say dangerous, she said. But yes. Can I see the letter? She glanced toward the staff table. It was addressed to the headmaster. Who I technically outrank in matters pertaining to the school, Harry said, and the moment the words came out he felt the slight jolt of them, not arrogance, just the honest application of the rule as written. He looked at McGonagall. I'm not trying to be difficult. I just want to know what they're actually asking. She nodded once, turned, went back to the staff table, and had what appeared to be a quiet and moderately tense exchange with Dumbledore. She came back with the letter. Harry read it. Hermione read it over his shoulder, her breathing going slightly faster through the second paragraph, which Harry noted meant the second paragraph was the important one. He read it again. The second paragraph said, in the careful language of official correspondence that was trying to be several contradictory things simultaneously, that the Ministry had reason to believe that the artifacts in question were classified as National Magical Heritage Objects under the Heritage and Artifacts Act of 1952, and that as such they were properly under Ministry custody and jurisdiction, and that the Ministry looked forward to discussing the appropriate arrangements for their secure and proper care. They want to take them, Ron said, reading over Harry's other shoulder. They want to try, Harry said. Can they? Neville asked. He'd arrived at the table as McGonagall left, as though drawn by the gravity of the unfolding thing. Legally, I mean. With Article 7. Article 7 predates the Ministry, Hermione said, in the tone of someone delivering a verdict. By about 800 years. The Heritage and Artifacts Act of 1952 cannot override a founding legal document from 980 AD, that would be like a bylaw overriding a constitution. But, she chewed her lip, the Ministry will argue that Article 7 is theoretical. That it was never formally tested. That there's no legal mechanism for a child to hold, there's one mechanism, Harry said. He set the letter down. The Wisengamot. If the charter's legitimate, and it is, a formal petition to the Wisengamot for recognition of the founder's heir would force them to rule on it publicly. He looked at Neville. You said your grandmother's on the Wisengamot. Neville sat up slightly. Yes. Do you think she'd take a letter seriously? Neville blinked. Then he got the expression of someone doing a rapid and quite specific calculation. She's been on the Wisengamot for 30 years, he said slowly. She takes everything seriously. She once drafted an amendment to magical creature rights legislation because a Botruckle looked at her in a way she found sympathetic. He paused. If you wrote to her tonight, she'd have it read by morning. And if she thought the charter was genuine, he trailed off, something glinting in his expression that Harry was starting to recognize as Neville's quiet version of intensity. She'd eat the Ministry for breakfast. Tonight then, Harry said. Hermione was already pulling parchment from her bag. The letter to Augusta Longbottom took 3 drafts, because Hermione kept revising the legal language and Harry kept revising Hermione's revisions back toward plain English, and after the second draft Ron pointed out that the letter needed to not sound like a legal brief or it would read as though Harry was 11 years old trying to sound like he wasn't 11 years old, which was worse than just sounding 11 years old. The third draft was direct, clear, and respectful without being deferential, and Harry signed it himself with the diadem sitting on the table beside the parchment throwing small silver light onto the words. He sealed it. Neville's owl took it without fuss. That evening in the common room, Harry didn't have a common room, technically, but he'd been spending evenings in the library, which was arguably better. He sat with his Transfiguration homework and his copy of A History of Magic and tried to think about the shape of the next week. The Ministry meeting was Wednesday. Today was Friday. 5 days to understand his position well enough to not be outmaneuvered by a room full of people who'd been playing this game since before he was born. He was 11. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have a political advisor. He had Hermione Granger, who was arguably better than either, Ron Weasley, whose family understood the Ministry from the inside and whose instincts about people were sharp in the way that came from growing up in a large family, and Neville Longbottom, whose grandmother apparently had opinions. And he had the diadem, which didn't give him knowledge but sharpened what was there. And the cup, which sat on the table beside him now, warm and present, and which he'd begun to understand represented something different than the diadem, not wit but worth, not cleverness but the deep knowing of what mattered, the Hufflepuff truth that constancy and loyalty and patient labor were not lesser things but the bedrock everything else was built on. He picked it up and held it, just for a moment. It felt like it was breathing. He put it down and opened his transfiguration homework and wrote 4 paragraphs on the theory of inanimate to animate transformation, and then spent 30 minutes reading about the founders themselves, not the mythology, not the pretty version in the guidebooks, but the actual historical record, which was messier and more human and considerably more interesting. Godric Gryffindor had been argumentative. It was documented in 4 separate sources. He'd fought with Salazar Slytherin constantly and apparently also with the Sorting Hat when it said things he disagreed with, which Harry found both surprising and deeply satisfying. Helga Hufflepuff had been the one who kept the school running in a practical sense: food, shelter, the daily architecture of a working institution, while the other 3 argued about philosophy. Rowena Ravenclaw had written the original magical theory that underpinned half of what was still being taught, and she'd done it in 5 languages simultaneously, leaving footnotes in a 6th that nobody had fully translated yet. They weren't symbols. They were people. They'd built something together by disagreeing constantly about what it should be and then building it anyway. That's, Harry thought, what I actually inherited. Not power, not authority, not sovereignty. An argument. A 1,000-year argument about what a school should be and who it should serve and what magic was for. An argument that the 4 of them had started and left for someone else to continue. He sat with that for a long time in the quiet library, while the castle settled around him for the night. Saturday morning brought an unexpected development in the form of a second-year Slytherin named Draco Malfoy, who appeared at the round table while Harry was eating breakfast alone, Hermione at the library already, Ron sleeping until the last possible moment before Quidditch tryouts he wasn't old enough to enter, Neville at Herbology Club, and stood with a posture that had been carefully designed to communicate that standing here was his own idea. Harry had already had one conversation with Malfoy, on the Hogwarts Express, which had been brief and had ended with Harry politely declining to shake Malfoy's hand on the grounds that he'd already shaken Ron's and he didn't want to do a comparative ranking. Malfoy had not taken this well, but he'd taken it with a certain chin-raised dignity that Harry had, privately, respected. Now he stood at the edge of the round table and looked at the sword and the cup and the diadem in turn, as though completing an inventory. "You're really not going to sort into a house," he said. "Apparently not," Harry said. "My father wrote to me." Malfoy pulled out the other chair and sat, which was interesting. He'd made it look like his decision, like an invitation was beneath him, but he'd sat. "He says the Ministry is furious." "I know. He says Dumbledore is furious too, though he's hiding it better." "I know that too," Harry said. Malfoy looked at him with the assessing expression of someone doing a calculation they're not ready to show the working of. "What are you going to do about the Ministry meeting?" "Have it," Harry said. "And say what?" "That the artifacts chose me and the charter says what it says and I'd like everyone to read the original document before forming opinions about how to manage it." He poured himself more pumpkin juice. "Why?" Malfoy was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table and he was looking at the cup with an expression that was, Harry thought, more honest than most of what Malfoy had shown him so far, something younger than the performance, something that was just genuinely experiencing wonder and not quite covering it with the right kind of studied indifference. "The Malfoys have always aligned with whoever held the most power," Malfoy said, and the flatness of his tone said he was reciting rather than confessing, that he'd heard this said by his father as a principle and was repeating it the way you repeat axioms. "It's not, my father would say it's strategy." "What would you say?" Harry asked. Malfoy's jaw shifted. "I'd say it's exhausting." He stood, the mask coming back up and into place with practiced speed. "I'm not offering friendship, Potter. I'm noting that you're the most interesting thing that's happened in this school since the war, and that Slytherin has a long tradition of backing the right horse." He straightened his robes. "I thought you should know we're watching." He left before Harry could respond, which was clearly deliberate, and Harry watched him go and thought that underneath the practiced Malfoy architecture there was someone doing a much more uncomfortable and honest version of what everyone else was doing, figuring out what the world was now, and where they stood in it. He went back to his eggs. On Sunday, Harry's magic spoke for the first time without him directing it, and it did it in front of witnesses. He was in the courtyard with Neville, who was talking about his herbology notes with the kind of focused enthusiasm he never showed in regular classes, and a group of older students, 4 of them, 5th years by the look, 2 Slytherin crests and 2 Gryffindor, which was an unusual enough combination to be suggestive, came around the corner and stopped when they saw Harry. "There he is," one of them said. A Slytherin boy, broad-shouldered, with the specific confidence of someone who was big enough not to have had to develop subtlety yet. The heir. The word was delivered with a flat scorn that was designed to be funny, to reduce Harry to a joke for the audience of his friends. Harry looked up. "Hello. Nice hat," the boy said. "Meaning the diadem." "Thanks," Harry said. "Is it true the ministry is coming to take it? And the sword and the cup?" His friends were grinning. Because that would be funny. All this, he gestured expansively at Harry's general existence, and then the ministry just walks in and takes it all back like a library book. "They're welcome to try," Harry said pleasantly. "Brent," Neville said, quietly, which apparently meant he knew this boy, and the way he said the name, not afraid, just warning, said something about the history there. The boy Brent looked at Neville with brief, dismissive contempt. "I'm talking to the heir." "No," Harry said, and his voice had changed. Not louder. Not harder. But different, the way temperature changes, a degree at a time, until suddenly the room is cold. "You're trying to make me feel small. There's a difference." The cup, sitting in Harry's bag by his feet, went warm. The warmth moved upward through the bag, through the ground, and the flagstones of the courtyard, all of them, every one, in a ripple outward from where Harry stood, shone, briefly, with the gold light. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just present. Just real, the way the sun is real when the clouds move. Brent took a step back. His friends stepped back too. Nobody said anything for a moment. Harry picked up his bag and his notes. "Neville, did you want to go to the greenhouses? You were saying there's something interesting in Greenhouse 3. "Yeah," Neville said, and his voice was very carefully steady, and behind his steadiness there was the specific private electricity of someone who has just watched something extraordinary and is processing it. "Yeah, there is." They walked past Brent and his friends, and the flagstones stopped glowing, and Harry didn't look back. "In the greenhouse," 10 minutes later, Neville said, "you did that on purpose." "I didn't," Harry said honestly. Neville looked at him sidelong. "It was still brilliant." "It wasn't me," Harry said. "Or, it was, but I wasn't directing it. It just," he tried to find the words for the thing that had happened and couldn't quite. "It felt like being defended," he said eventually. "Like the castle was defending me. Or the artifacts. Like they saw someone being unkind and they said no." Neville was quiet for a moment, running his thumb gently along the leaf of an unusual plant that was, by the look of it, extremely pleased to be touched. "My mum and dad," he said, and his voice was careful with the words, handling them like something fragile, before they're in St. Mungo's. "Long-term ward. They don't know me anymore." He kept looking at the plant. "I used to think that I just wasn't good enough at magic for it to respond to me the way it does to other people. My grand's dragon-boggling at it. My uncle literally melted a sofa once. And I couldn't get my wand to do anything reliable." A pause. "Until Monday night. When you sat down." Harry looked at him. "I was 3 tables away," Neville said, "and I felt it. And the next morning in herbology I repotted a mandrake seedling without gloves because I forgot and the professor was horrified, but the mandrake didn't scream. It just sat there. Like it was comfortable." He finally looked at Harry. "I think being near you wakes things up." Harry turned this over. "Or being near the artifacts." "Maybe," Neville said. Or maybe you're not just carrying the artifacts. Maybe you're part of what they are now. He went back to his plant, slightly pink in the face as though he'd said more than he intended. I'm just saying it doesn't seem coincidental. Harry thought about the chart of the founders, their interlocking handwriting on the ancient parchment, the way each of them had represented something different and necessary. Gryffindor the courage. Ravenclaw the wit. Hufflepuff the worth. Slytherin the ambition, the drive, the long game, the willingness to endure. He had all four. He was learning how to use them one at a time. Let's look at your interesting plant, he said. Neville showed him, and for 20 minutes they were just two 11-year-olds in a greenhouse on a Sunday morning, and the castle around them was warm. On Tuesday evening, the night before the ministry meeting, Dumbledore came to find Harry in the library. He didn't come with performance this time. He came alone, without the warm grandfather manner, and sat across from Harry at the reading table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at Harry with the expression of a man who has decided to try honesty as a tactic and is slightly uncertain how it will be received. I owe you a fuller answer, he said, to the question you asked me at breakfast on Tuesday. What were you going to do with me? Harry set down his quill. Okay. You were going to be kept secret, Dumbledore said, in the sense that the full scope of your survival, of the event that happened when Voldemort's curse rebounded, was not publicly known. I intended to let you grow up ordinary. Or as ordinary as possible given, a brief pause, given what you are. I intended to bring you to Hogwarts, guide your education, and prepare you for a confrontation that I believe will come in time, when Voldemort returns. You think he's coming back, Harry said. I know it. No hesitation at all. He is not gone. He is diminished, but he has not passed. And when he returns, you will be central to the confrontation. He held Harry's gaze. I had planned to give you that information gradually. When you were older. When you were ready. I'm not angry about it, Harry said. Dumbledore waited. I understand the logic, Harry said. I'm 11. There's a genuine argument for not handing an 11-year-old a prophecy about mortal combat. He picked up his quill and turned it in his fingers. But you were also planning to control the whole thing. The narrative, the information, the timing, the relationships I'd make, the choices I'd think were mine. Weren't you? Dumbledore didn't deny it. That, Harry thought, was worth something. The artifacts changed that, Harry said. Because now it's not private. It never will be again. Tomorrow the ministry comes, and whatever happens at that meeting sets a tone, and the tone spreads. He set the quill down. I'd rather face it clear-eyed than perform ignorance we both know I don't have. What do you want from tomorrow? Dumbledore asked. Harry thought about it honestly. I want them to understand that the charter is real and that I'm not going to hand over the artifacts. I'm not going to make enemies. Fudge isn't my enemy, he's just scared. But I'm not going to let them manage me either. He looked at the old man across the table. And I want you in the room. Dumbledore looked slightly surprised. You want me there? You know these people. You know how they think. Harry held his gaze. I said I'd do this with your help if you offered it. The offer stands. I just need you to be on my side, not managing what side I'm on. The silence that followed was the most honest one Harry had sat in since arriving at Hogwarts. Outside the library windows, the Scottish sky had gone fully dark and the stars were extraordinary, and somewhere in the castle the ghosts were having some kind of debate that echoed distantly through the walls. All right, Dumbledore said quietly. All right, you'll be there. All right, I'll be on your side. He said it like a man making a promise he intended to keep and was aware he might find difficult. And Harry, the meeting tomorrow. Fudge will come with at least 2 aurors and possibly a legal advisor. He will attempt to classify the artifacts as ministry property. He will use words like safekeeping and national heritage and the child's best interests. He will be entirely sincere in every word he says, which makes him more dangerous than if he were lying. He paused. Have you prepared? Harry smiled. Hermione prepared, he said. Same thing. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment, and then, slowly, he smiled back, and this time the smile had nothing behind it except what it was. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. The library was quiet around them, the castle breathing steadily in the dark, and tomorrow was arriving the way all important days arrived, 1 hour at a time, inevitable as tides. Harry was ready. Chapter 3, The storm arrives. The ministry delegation arrived at 9 in the morning in a cluster of expensive robes and self-important footsteps, and Harry watched them cross the entrance hall from the top of the main staircase with the particular calm of someone who had spent the previous evening doing something more useful than sleeping. Cornelius Fudge was shorter than Harry had expected. He had the kind of face that had probably been pleasant once and had since been reshaped by years of performing confidence in front of people he was quietly terrified of. He wore lime green robes and carried a bowler hat in one hand as though he might need it for emotional support. Behind him came 2 Aurors, a broad woman with close-cropped hair and a wand already loosely in her hand, and a thin man with careful eyes who moved like he was cataloguing the room, and a witch in deep burgundy robes carrying a briefcase who had the specific expression of a ministry legal advisor, which is to say the expression of someone who has read every relevant document and is already 3 arguments ahead of whatever you're about to say. McGonagall was meeting them in the entrance hall. Dumbledore stood beside her. The delegation had not seen Harry yet. Harry came down the stairs. He wasn't wearing robes today, except his school ones, which were ordinary and slightly rumpled in the way of someone who'd been up early. The diadem was at his brow. The cup was in his bag. He'd left the sword in the great hall because it was fixed in stone and he couldn't bring it, but he'd discovered in the past 3 days that he didn't need to carry it for it to be present. The weight of it was with him whether he was standing beside it or not, like the way you can feel a fire behind you without turning to look. Hermione was on his left. Ron was on his right. Neville was half a step behind him with his wand in his pocket and his grandmother's letter of acknowledgement, received yesterday evening, 3 inches of dense legal opinion in Augusta Longbottom's precise handwriting, the key sentence of which read: the Founders' Charter of 980 AD is a primary legal instrument and supersedes all subsequent ministry legislation in matters pertaining to Hogwarts governance and its hereditary stewardship, folded carefully in his jacket. Fudge looked up and saw Harry on the stairs, and his expression went through 4 things very quickly: relief that the boy existed and was physically manageable, discomfort at the diadem, a politician's automatic calculation of how to proceed, and underneath all 3, genuine and undisguised awe, gone before anyone less attentive would have caught it. Harry Potter, Fudge said. He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced but not dishonest. He'd probably meant it, once, before whatever combination of pressures had taught him to use it as a tool. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Minister, Harry said. He reached the bottom of the stairs and shook Fudge's hand, because not shaking it would have been a statement and he didn't need to make statements yet. Thank you for coming to Hogwarts rather than asking me to come to London. I appreciate it. Fudge blinked. That wasn't what he prepared for. He recovered smoothly. He was good at recovering smoothly, it was probably one of his actual skills. Of course, you're a student, it seemed the sensible. He gestured toward the corridor leading to the large meeting room McGonagall had arranged. Shall we? They sat around a long table, Fudge and his legal advisor and the 2 Aurors on one side, Dumbledore and McGonagall flanking Harry on the other, with Hermione, Ron, and Neville ranged behind him in the chairs along the wall. Fudge had looked at the 3 first years and opened his mouth, and Harry had said, quietly, "They're with me," and the legal advisor had made a small note, and Fudge had decided not to press it. The legal advisor's name was Dolores Umbridge, and she had a smile that lived on her face the way certain weeds live in gardens, persistently, and without invitation. Now then, Fudge began, drawing out a folder of parchment. This is an informal meeting, of course, we're not here in any official enforcement capacity, purely a preliminary discussion, an opportunity to, minister, Harry said. I've read your letter. You want to take the artifacts. Fudge opened his mouth. Closed it. The Heritage and Artifacts Act of 1952 classifies them as National Magical Heritage Objects, and you believe that gives the Ministry custodial jurisdiction. Harry rested his hands flat on the table. I'd like to address that directly, if we can, rather than arriving there after 40 minutes. Umbridge's smile adjusted. She set her quill on her parchment with a small precise click. That's a rather direct approach for, he's 11, not simple, Hermione said from behind Harry, and then appeared slightly startled that she'd said it aloud. Ron pressed his lips together. Fudge cleared his throat. The artifacts in question, the Sword of Gryffindor, Hufflepuff's cup, the diadem of Ravenclaw, are, under current legislation, classified as, they're mine, Harry said. Not because I claimed them. Because they claimed me. There's a legal distinction. He reached into his robes and withdrew the charter. He set it on the table and pushed it to the center with one finger, the way you place a card face up to end a particular argument. The Founders' Charter of 980 AD. The original document, not a copy. Article 7 establishes the precedence of the heir's authority over any subsequent legislation in matters pertaining to the artifacts and the school. He looked at Umbridge's briefcase. I imagine you have a copy of the 1952 Act in there. The charter predates it by 972 years. Umbridge opened her briefcase. Her smile hadn't moved, which was doing something unsettling to her face. She withdrew a file and began scanning it with the speed of someone who reads legal documents the way other people read menus, fluently and with opinions. The charter, she said pleasantly, is a historical document whose legal applicability in the modern wizarding governance framework has never been formally tested. It hasn't needed to be, Harry said. The conditions for its application have never arisen before. An untested clause isn't an inapplicable one. Umbridge looked up from her file. Harry looked back at her. Dumbledore, to Harry's left, said nothing, and the particular quality of his silence was the most supportive thing he could have offered. There are, Umbridge said, each word smooth and considered, significant concerns about the well-being and appropriate guidance of a minor who finds himself in an unprecedented situation. The Ministry's interest is not adversarial. It is protective. We want to ensure that you have the support and structure appropriate to your age and circumstances. That's very kind, Harry said. I have a school, a headmaster, 4 sets of professors, my friends, and the legal opinion of a 30-year Wisengamot member that the charter gives me clear standing. He paused. What specifically is your concern about my well-being? A beat. Fudge shifted in his chair. The artifacts, Umbridge said carefully, are extraordinarily powerful objects. Ensuring they are handled safely, they chose me, Harry said, for the second time, with exactly the same weight as the first. If they were unsafe in my hands, they wouldn't have come to them. The room was quiet. McGonagall, to Harry's right, had both hands flat on the table and the expression of someone watching a chess match they hadn't been told was taking place. The Wisengamot member you mentioned, Fudge said, abruptly, leaning forward. Who, Augusta Longbottom, Harry said. Neville, behind him, produced the letter and passed it forward, and Harry slid it across the table. Her legal opinion on the charter and the applicability of Article 7. She's requesting that the Wisengamot formally recognize the heir of the founders within the month. Fudge picked up the letter. Read it. Set it down. His face had gone the specific color of someone receiving information they'd hoped wouldn't exist yet. Augusta Longbottom she is certainly a distinguished member. She's also not the only one who'll have an opinion once this is public, Harry said. I'm not threatening you, Minister. I'm noting that you're probably better served by getting ahead of this story than by trying to suppress it. Fudge looked at him across the table, at this 11-year-old boy in school robes with an ancient crown on his head who spoke like someone who had been in rooms like this before, not with arrogance but with a specific quiet sureness that was somehow more unnerving than arrogance because it didn't need anything from you. His expression did something human, briefly. The calculation dropped away and what was underneath was a man genuinely uncertain for the first time in a meeting he'd been certain about when he arrived. "What do you want?" Fudge asked. Simply. Man to, well, boy, technically, but it didn't feel that way. To go to school, Harry said. To learn magic, do my homework, figure out Quidditch. To be left alone to do that without the ministry deciding I'm a problem that needs managing. He held Fudge's gaze. I'm not your enemy. I'm not anyone's enemy right now. I'm a first-year student with 4 artifacts and a legal document that I'd rather not need to use. He let that sit for a moment. The question is whether you'd rather have me as an ongoing argument or as a fact that's already been resolved. Fudge was quiet for a long moment. Umbridge was looking at Harry with an expression that had moved past the smile into something Harry filed away carefully, something cold and patient and thoughtful, the expression of someone who has decided that this conversation is not the right one, that there will be other conversations, that there is time. That expression told him more about Dolores Umbridge than anything she'd said. I think, Fudge said, we should take some time to review the charter and Madame Longbottom's opinion before any further steps are taken. That seems sensible, Harry said. The artifacts remain with you, for now, pending that review. They'll remain with me after the review as well, Harry said, pleasantly. But yes. Fudge stood. His delegation stood. They exchanged formal courtesies and Dumbledore said several things that smoothed the edges of the departure without changing its substance, and then they were gone, footsteps receding across the entrance hall, the heavy door of Hogwarts closing behind them. The meeting room held its breath. Ron exhaled like he'd been underwater. Bloody hell. Language, McGonagall said automatically. That, Hermione said, standing up with her notes. She'd been taking notes the entire time, in the small dense handwriting she used when she was working fast, was extraordinary. The Umbridge woman. Did you see her face when you cited Article 7? I saw it, Harry said. She's not done, Hermione said. She wrote something at the end. It wasn't a note. It was too short for a note. It was a name. Harry looked at her. Whose? I couldn't see from where I was sitting. She pressed her lips together with the specific frustration of having been almost close enough. But she wrote it down like it was a reminder. Something to do later. We'll watch her, Harry said. McGonagall had been quiet since the delegation left. She stood now with her arms folded, looking at Harry with an expression that had the quality of several competing things resolving into a single one. Where did you learn to do that? She asked. Do what? Conduct yourself like that in a room full of people who have 40 years more experience than you. Harry thought about it honestly. I've been trying to get adults not to manage me since I was old enough to understand they were doing it, he said. I've just never had anything to negotiate with before. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 10 points. And I don't care that we don't have a mechanism for it. She left. The door swung shut behind her. Neville retrieved Augusta's letter from the table, folded it, tucked it away. His expression was the quietly electric one. She's going to be, when I tell her how that went, tell her thank you, Harry said. Genuinely. Neville nodded and went ahead of them, already composing the letter in his head by the look of him. Harry picked up the charter and put it back in his robes. Ron was looking at the door Fudge had left through. The Umbridge one, he said. Dad's mentioned her. At the ministry. He searched for words with the care of someone choosing from a shelf. She has a very particular way of thinking about power. Like it belongs to whoever's already got it, and anyone new to it is by definition using it wrong. She thinks I'm using it wrong, Harry said. She thinks you're using it at all, Ron said. And she thinks that's wrong. Harry considered Dolores Umbridge, the smile that didn't move, the cold patient thing underneath it. He filed her away under later, and seriously. Not a frontal opponent. Something that moved sideways. Right, he said. I'm going to be late for charms. The story broke on Thursday. Rita Skeeter's piece in the Daily Prophet ran on the front page under the headline, Founder's Heir, The Truth Hogwarts and the Ministry Don't Want You to Know. It had a photograph, Harry in the Great Hall, taken by a photographer who had apparently been hidden in the rafters on the first evening, because nobody had been let in, showing the moment the diadem descended and the golden light of the cup rolled across the floor. In the photograph, Harry was sitting at the round table looking upward with an expression that was somehow both 11 years old and ancient, and the light made it look like a painting. The story was not entirely accurate. Several details had been invented or embellished in ways that were technically unprovable as false, and Skeeter had a prose style that moved between reportage and myth with the ease of someone who considered them interchangeable. But the core of it, the sorting, the 4 artifacts, the round table rising from the floor, the hat's declaration, was correct. And the charter. She had the charter. Not accurately quoted, but clearly sourced from someone who had read it. Harry ate his breakfast while reading it and identified 4 factual errors, 2 misleading framings, and 1 direct fabrication, and also noted that the story was compelling, exciting, and would be believed by essentially everyone who read it whether or not the details were precise. She got the charter from inside the school, Hermione said, reading over his shoulder, incandescent in the specific way she got incandescent when intellectual honesty was being violated. Someone who was at the meeting or who Dumbledore spoke to afterward, Harry said. Dumbledore, to his credit, looked about as comfortable at the staff table as someone sitting on something sharp and being polite about it. He'd seen the prophet. Half the castle had seen the prophet. The owls had arrived at breakfast like a weather event, the sky above the great hall suddenly thick with wings, and the noise level had gone from morning subdued to a continuous roar that the enchanted ceiling seemed to find appropriately dramatic, because it had shifted from its usual cloud simulation to something that looked like a building storm. By lunchtime, 3 things had happened. First, 53 owls had arrived for Harry, from strangers across Wizarding Britain, some curious, some congratulatory, some frightened, a few hostile, and one that contained nothing but a hand-drawn image of a lightning bolt which Harry couldn't decide was a tribute or a threat. Second, the Daily Prophet had issued a follow-up article, shorter, published as a special midday edition, confirming that the Ministry had visited Hogwarts on Wednesday and had left without the artifacts. Third, a letter from the Wisingamoth's office addressed to the Headmaster of Hogwarts had arrived, cc'd in an unprecedented piece of bureaucratic theatre to the individual identified as heir of the founders per the Charter of 980 AD, requesting formal confirmation of the Charter's authenticity. Harry was eating lunch with his friends when the letter arrived addressed to him. He opened it, read the Wisingamoth's careful official language, and passed it to Hermione. She read it twice. "They're going to debate it in formal session," she said. "The Charter. They want testimony." "When?" She scanned down the parchment. 3 weeks. "Good," Harry said. He took a piece of bread. "Good." Ron said. "You have to go before the Wisingamoth." "The Wisingamoth is a court," Harry said. "Courts follow rules. Rules I can prepare for." He looked at Ron. "It's the things that don't follow rules I'm worried about." Ron considered this. "Like Umbridge." "Like Umbridge," Harry agreed. The owls kept coming through the afternoon. By dinner, the count was past 120. Hedwig, Harry's snowy owl, returned from an errand Harry had sent her on that morning and landed on his forearm with a letter that she appeared to have carried with particular care, which was Hedwig's way of saying it was important. The letter was from a solicitor in Diagon Alley, a woman named Andromeda Tonks, who wrote in precise clear sentences that she had read the morning's Prophet, had access to the legal history of the Charter, and was offering her services if Harry found himself in need of proper representation before the Wisingamoth. Harry passed it to Hermione. She read it. Andromeda Tonks. She was a black, her family's one of the oldest in Wizarding Britain. She was disowned for marrying a Muggle-born. A pause. She knows the old legal traditions from the inside. And she has reason to want institutions held accountable. Can you write back tonight? Harry asked. Already mentally drafting it, she said. Neville looked up from his shepherd's pie. My Gran knows her. She's formidable. That seems to be the requirement, Ron said cheerfully. Everyone in Harry's corner is either brilliant or formidable or both. What does that make you? Harry asked. Loyal and funny, Ron said without hesitation. Which history consistently undervalues. Harry grinned, and for a moment the weight of the day, the owls, the Wisengamot letter, Skeeter's article and its 1,000 ripples, the cold patient thing in Umbridge's expression, lifted, and they were just 4 11-year-olds eating shepherd's pie on a Thursday. The castle held them in its warmth, and outside the windows the Scottish autumn was arriving with its grey and gold. Saturday brought a different kind of problem. Harry had known it was coming, not specifically, but he'd learned in the first week that Hogwarts ran on several parallel social economies simultaneously, and that the disruption he represented had sent all of them into unfamiliar configurations, and that at some point the disruption would express itself through people rather than through official channels. He was in the library, working on an essay for History of Magic, which was taught by a ghost named Professor Binns who appeared to be either unaware of recent events or had simply decided that the fall of the Goblin Rebellion of 1752 was more important, a position Harry found hard to entirely disagree with, when Percy Weasley appeared. Percy was a prefect. He was also, as Harry had come to understand, a person whose entire sense of self was organized around institutional hierarchy in the way that some people's sense of self is organized around family, or music, or sport. The institution was Percy's home, and the artifacts had rearranged the institution, and Percy had been visibly bothered by this since Monday in the way of someone whose furniture has all been moved 2 inches while they were sleeping. Potter, Percy said, sitting across from him with the posture of someone about to deliver remarks he'd prepared. I wanted to speak with you as a prefect. Okay, Harry said, and kept his quill moving because he had 2 more inches to write and History of Magic was due Monday. The situation, this past week. It's been disruptive to school routine. The owls at meals, the reporters trying to get onto school grounds, Filch caught 2 this morning near the greenhouse, and the students in the corridors spending a lot of time discussing political matters that are, frankly, not their concern. Some of it is their concern, Harry said. The school's governance affects them. Percy's jaw moved. What I'm trying to say is, and I'm saying this as a representative of the school's prefect body, there's concern that the attention you're attracting is not conducive to the orderly running of, Percy, Harry said, and he set his quill down and gave Percy his full attention, because Percy deserved his full attention even if what he was saying was slightly maddening. Do you think I asked for any of this? Percy opened his mouth. Genuinely asking, Harry said. Do you think I put myself at the sorting stool and pulled the sword out of the wall and made the cup fly across the great hall because I wanted attention? No, Percy said, more quietly. I don't think that. Then what's the concern, specifically? Percy sat with this for a moment. The library was quiet around them, the late afternoon light falling through tall windows onto crowded shelves. I don't know what the rules are anymore, he said, finally, and the admission had the quality of something it cost him. The point system doesn't work with you. The house system doesn't apply. You're technically, according to that charter, in a position that supersedes the headmaster's authority in certain respects. And I don't know, I can't find the rule that covers this. A pause. I need there to be a rule. Harry looked at him with a genuineness that was one of the things people consistently didn't prepare for in him, the capacity to take people seriously at their exact level of honesty. I think that's fair, he said. And I think the honest answer is that we're making the rules as we go right now, which I know is uncomfortable. He picked up his quill again. What I can tell you is that I'm not trying to dismantle anything. The artifacts are mine and the charter is real and I'm going to tell the truth about it when people ask. That's all I'm doing. Percy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the specific tone of someone performing a recalibration. Ron seems good. Having you around. He's a good person, Harry said. Yes. Percy stood. Straightened his badge. Yes. He left with the walk of someone who hadn't entirely resolved what they'd come to resolve but was going to have to live with that. Harry went back to his essay. Hermione appeared 20 minutes later, dropped into the chair across from him, and said, without preamble, "I found something." Her voice had the specific quality it got when she'd been in the stacks for several hours following a thread that had turned out to go somewhere important. She had dust on her robes and ink on 2 fingers and she was vibrating with contained urgency. "What?" Harry said. She put a book on the table. "Old. Very old, the kind of old where the leather of the cover had absorbed decades of handling and gone smooth and dark. The Governance of the Ancient Schools, a Legal and Historical Survey, 1743. She had it open to a chapter called The Founders' Charter, Provisions, Precedents, and the Question of Suppression. Harry looked at the chapter heading. "The question of what?" "Suppression," she said. "Harry, there are 3 other articles in the Charter after Article 7. Nobody quotes them. They're not in Hogwarts, a history. They're not in any of the standard references." She pressed her finger to a paragraph. Article 8. Article 9. Article 10. Harry read. He read slowly. Then he read again. "Hermione," he said. "I know. Article 9 says, I know what it says. It says that any individual who knowingly conceals, withholds, or misrepresents the existence or substance of the Charter to the detriment of the recognized heir commits an act of treachery against the school and law, and is subject to the censure of the Wisengamot." He looked up. "Which means if someone had the Charter and knew about these articles and didn't tell me, or told the minister the Charter was a historical curiosity," Hermione said. The words landed in the quiet library like a stone in still water. Dumbledore. Not as an accusation that Harry made aloud. Not as a conclusion he raced to. As a question he held, careful and precise, the way you hold something fragile, testing its weight, its temperature, whether it was what it appeared to be. He had called it a historical curiosity in his letters to Augusta Longbottom. 3 times, Neville had said. He could have meant it genuinely, Harry said. He might not have thought the conditions could be triggered. "He's the most brilliant wizard alive," Hermione said. "His definition of impossible is narrower than most people's. That doesn't prove intent." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "But it's a question that exists. And the Wisengamot is going to ask it." Harry sat back in his chair. Through the library window, the sky had gone the deep gold of late afternoon, and the trees at the edge of the grounds were moving in a wind that was picking up speed from the north. The storm the enchanted ceiling had been hinting at all week was arriving. He thought about Dumbledore on Tuesday evening, saying "I'll be on your side" with the gravity of a promise. He thought about Umbridge writing something down. He thought about the 3 articles nobody quoted, sitting in a 1743 legal survey in a library that Dumbledore had stocked personally. "Make a copy," he said. 3 copies. 1 for Andromeda Tonks. 1 for Augusta Longbottom. 1 we keep. Hermione was already reaching for fresh parchment. Harry looked back at the book, at the old dense text and the careful legal language of people long dead who had thought ahead, who had anticipated exactly this, anticipated someone knowing and not saying, someone managing the heir rather than serving them, someone treating the ancient law as an inconvenience to be quietly folded away. He felt the diadem cool against his brow, and the distant warmth of the cup in his bag, and the pull of the sword in the great hall, and underneath all 3, deeper than any of them, the thing the hat had pressed gently against the inside of his head on the first night, the sense of the wheel, all the spokes at once. He understood, for the first time completely, what being chosen by all 4 meant. It didn't mean being the most powerful. It meant being the most complete, courage without recklessness, wit without coldness, worth without complacency, ambition without cruelty. The 4 balanced together into something that none of them were alone. He would need all 4 in the next 3 weeks. The quill scratched steadily across parchment, Hermione's hand moving fast, and the storm came in off the highlands and broke across Hogwarts in a sound like applause. That night, late, when the castle was quiet, Harry stood at the window of the empty classroom he'd taken to using as a thinking space, 3rd floor, east wing, good view of the grounds, and held the conversation he'd been putting off having with himself. Someone was going to get hurt by what was coming. Not physically. But reputation, power, the careful architecture of a life's work, those things were going to be tested, and tested publicly, and some of them wouldn't survive the testing intact. He wasn't afraid of that. He'd been honest with himself about it since the library, since reading Article 9, since understanding what the Wizengamot session in 3 weeks actually represented. But he was allowed to notice that it was heavy. He'd been at Hogwarts for 10 days. He'd meant it when he told Fudge he just wanted to go to school, do homework, figure out Quidditch. He'd meant it with his whole chest. He was 11 years old and he wanted ordinary things in the way that only people who'd been denied ordinary things can want them, purely, specifically, with a fierce and private hunger. He was not going to get ordinary. Not this year. Probably not for a long time. The grounds were dark and rain-swept, and somewhere out there in the forbidden forest something moved at the tree-lean, large, and unhurried, and entirely untroubled by storms. Harry watched it for a moment and felt, oddly, comforted. The castle was full of things that had been here longer than any of this trouble, and they were entirely indifferent to it, and there was a kind of peace in that. He went to bed. He slept without dreaming, which was not something that happened often, and he took it as the good omen it probably was. 3 weeks to the Wizengamot. Andromeda Tonks's copies going out with Hedwig at dawn. Augusta Longbottom's response likely by Monday. The Prophet's ripples still spreading, letters still arriving, the Ministry still reviewing, Umbridge still writing names on her notepad. And Dumbledore, in his office above the gargoyle staircase, making decisions that Harry did not yet know about. Harry slept, and the storm moved east, and the castle breathed around him, patient and old and entirely on his side. Chapter 4, The Writ of the Founders. The letter from Andromeda Tonks arrived on Monday morning with a reply so swift it suggested she'd been waiting for exactly the kind of correspondence Harry had sent, the way a door swings open the moment someone finally knocks who was supposed to. Her handwriting was precise and unhurried, the kind that communicated competence without trying to. She confirmed receipt of the charter copies, confirmed she'd already sent one to her own legal archive with a preservation charm, and then spent 3 paragraphs doing something nobody else had done yet, treating Harry as a client, not a ward. She outlined the Wizengamot session's likely structure, identified the 3 Wizengamot members most likely to be hostile, named 2 others who had historical ties to the founder's legacy and could be persuaded, and closed with a line that Harry read twice: "The Ministry will attempt to reframe this as a question of your fitness to hold authority. Our task is to make clear that the charter requires no fitness test. The artifacts already administered one." Harry folded the letter carefully and put it with the charter. Hermione had read over his shoulder, as was becoming habitual. "She's good," she said, with the tone of one professional assessing another across a very significant age gap. "She's going to be great," Harry said. The week moved fast. Classes had their own momentum, the comfortable rhythm of learning things, the particular pleasure of charms where Flitwick had moved Harry onto second-year material by Wednesday without making a fuss about it, just sliding the new textbook onto his desk with a small nod as though they'd agreed on this in advance. Transfiguration continued to develop into something that felt less like a lesson and more like a conversation between Harry and the magic itself, McGonagall watching him with that expression that was becoming her characteristic Harry expression, controlled wonder with a foundation of something that might have been relief. Potions remained potions. Snape had settled into a pattern of testing Harry with questions designed to find the ceiling and expressing the result not in praise but in the progressive reduction of skepticism, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Harry had begun to understand that Snape's respect was not something you received. It was something you removed obstacles from, and then it arrived on its own, reluctantly, like a cat deciding it had chosen to sit near you. On Thursday, Neville achieved something remarkable. They were in herbology, Greenhouse 2, working with a plant called Devil's Snare which responded to light and warmth and which most first-years approached with the nervous energy of handling something that wanted to hurt them. Neville approached it the way he approached all plants, with calm attention and genuine interest, and the Devil's Snare, apparently recognizing the difference, relaxed entirely in his hands. Professor Sprout stopped the class to watch. She said, quietly, "Mr. Longbottom, what are you doing differently?" Neville looked up from the plant, which was lying placidly across his forearms like a contented cat. "I'm not scared of it," he said. "I know it reacts to fear. So I just didn't." Harry, working beside him, had smiled privately at his soil because that was possibly the most Hufflepuff thing he'd ever heard, and he meant that as the highest possible compliment. The round table in the Great Hall had become, in the space of 2 weeks, a kind of informal landmark. Students passed it the way people pass local monuments, casually, but with awareness. The Sword of Gryffindor had been incorporated into the dining landscape without anyone consciously deciding to do so. Second years had started touching the flat of the blade for luck before exams, a tradition that had apparently begun as a joke among the Gryffindors and then quietly spread to the other houses with the unstoppable momentum of all the best traditions, which is to say nobody remembered deciding it was real before it already was. Malfoy had come back to the table twice more. Both times on his own, both times with the same performance of casual calculation that covered something more honest. On Thursday he'd sat long enough to discuss the Wisengamot session. He knew more about Wisengamot procedure than Harry did, which was useful, and he shared it with the manner of someone who has decided to be helpful and is slightly annoyed by his own decision. Harry thanked him directly, which appeared to make him more annoyed and also more inclined to come back. Ron had watched this development with narrowed eyes and then said, privately, to Harry, "He's not a bad person. He's just been built badly." A pause. "I still don't trust him." "Neither do I," Harry said. "But I don't need to trust him. I just need to understand him." Ron thought about this. "That's very Slytherin of you." "Good," Harry said. The Friday of the second week, Harry woke at 4 in the morning. Not from a dream. Not from noise. He woke the way you wake when something has shifted in a room, the specific alertness of a changed atmosphere. He lay in the dark of the empty dormitory. He'd been given a room of his own in a small turret adjacent to the Great Hall, a practical solution to the absence of a house, and he'd come to love the way it held the sound of the castle, and felt the diadem on the bedside table pulsing with a slow, irregular rhythm. Not alarmed. Urgent. He got up, dressed, put the diadem on, picked up the cup. The sword he couldn't carry, but he'd given up feeling separated from it. He went out. The castle was the profound dark of 4 in the morning, lit by torches that had burned low and were throwing orange and shadow in equal measure. His feet knew where they were going before he did, the diadem doing the thing where it sharpened existing knowledge into direction, and the direction was down, and north, and eventually into a part of the castle he hadn't been before. Sub-basement level, past the kitchens, past a corridor that smelled of history and stone and old water, to a door that was not remarkable in any way except that it had no handle. Just a smooth stone face and the faint impression of 4 symbols carved in a line at eye level, a lion, a badger, an eagle, a serpent, arranged in a circle rather than in sequence, eating each other's tails. Harry put his hand flat on the door. It opened. The room behind it was not large. It was circular, which echoed the table in the Great Hall and the Charter's interlocking symbols, and it was completely empty except for a stone plinth at its center, waist-high, on which sat a single book. Not a dramatic book. Not ancient-looking and iron-bound and covered in warning runes. Just a book. Medium-sized, leather-covered in deep green that had faded to something between green and gray, with no title on the spine. The kind of book that looked like a journal. Harry crossed the room and picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the cover, every wall in the circular room lit, not with torches, not with magic fire, but with writing. Dense, overlapping lines of 4 distinct handwriting styles, covering the stone from floor to ceiling, wrapping around continuously so that you had to turn in a circle to read it, the words from one writer running in the spaces between another's, the whole thing organized like a conversation that had been going for a very long time. The founder's writing. He recognized the styles from the charter, the bold decisive strokes of Gryffindor, Hufflepuff's rounded practical hand, Ravenclaw's fine precise letters, Slytherin's narrow elegant script. Harry stood at the center of the room and turned slowly, reading. He didn't read all of it, there was too much for a single night and he understood that immediately, but he read enough. The walls were not instructions. They were not a manual for being the heir. They were exactly what they looked like, a conversation, a 1,000-year argument about what Hogwarts should be, what Britain should be, what magic was for, who it belonged to, what responsibilities came with it. The founders arguing with each other in writing, in the way that people who trust each other argue, without performance, without managing impressions, just saying what they believed and why. The book in his hand was the conclusion. Or not the conclusion, there was no conclusion to this argument, that was the point, but the resolution. The thing they'd agreed on in the end, after everything. He opened it. The first page had 4 lines, one in each handwriting. Courage without wisdom is violence. Wisdom without loyalty is vanity. Our loyalty without worth is habit. Worth without courage is comfort. And below those 4 lines, in all 4 scripts simultaneously, the same sentence written 4 times over in 4 different hands, intertwined so that every letter touched another's, the heir is not given the school. The heir is given the argument. Carry it forward. Harry read it 3 times. Then he closed the book and held it under his arm and looked at the walls, at 4 extraordinary people who had built something together and disagreed about it constantly and loved it fiercely and left it in trust for someone they'd never meet who would understand it completely. He understood it completely. He stood there for a long moment in the room full of their writing, and the diadem was warm on his brow, and the cup was warm in his hand, and the pull of the sword was a warmth in his chest like a compass finding north. All right, he said aloud, to nobody, to all 4 of them at once. I've got it. He went back to his room and slept 2 more hours, dreamlessly, with the book on the pillow beside him. He said nothing about the room to anyone immediately. Not because he was hiding it, he'd resolved early that hiding things was for people who needed leverage, and he didn't operate that way, but because he needed a day to understand what he'd been given before he could describe it. The book went into his bag beside the charter and the cup, and he carried the weight of it through Friday's classes with the specific private attention of someone holding a new idea up to different lights. By Friday evening he knew what it was for. Not as an abstract, practically. Specifically. In 3 weeks. He found Hermione in the library after dinner. She was working on an astronomy essay but she had 3 other books open at the same time because Hermione at rest was still Hermione at oblique angles to information. He sat down, put the book on the table between them, and told her about the room. She listened without interrupting, which was not nothing. She looked at the book. She looked at Harry. Can I read it? Later, yes. Right now I want to tell you what I think it's for. He put his finger on the cover. The charter gives me standing. Article 7, the Wisengamot Session, Andromeda Tonks, Augusta Longbottom, all of that establishes that the heir exists and the artifacts are legitimate and the ministry can't take them. That's defensive. He looked at her. This is offensive. Offensive how? The founders wrote their school's governance into 2 documents, Harry said. The charter is the legal instrument, the one that deals with authority and artifacts and succession. But this, he touched the book again, this is the second document. The writ. The operating principles. What the school is actually for, how it should actually run, what the heir is actually supposed to do with the authority the charter grants. He held her gaze. The charter says I have sovereign stewardship over the school and its traditions. The writ defines what that stewardship means. Specifically. Hermione was very still. What does it mean specifically? It means I can change things, Harry said. Not cosmetically. Structurally. I can reform curriculum. I can establish or revoke rules. I can override staff decisions that contradict the school's founding principles. I can grant or remove teaching positions. He paused, letting that settle. The writ lists all of it. With the charter as the legal basis and the writ as the operational framework, the heir isn't just a ceremonial title. It's a functioning role. Harry, Hermione said, carefully. That's enormous. I know. If you walk into the Wizengamot with both documents, it changes the nature of the session completely, he said. They're expecting to debate whether the charter is real and whether a first year can hold a historical title. Instead, I'd be presenting a complete constitutional framework that's been sitting in the school's foundations for 1,000 years, just waiting for someone to find it. He looked at her. The question stops being is he the heir and becomes here is what the heir's authority entails, in full, as written by the founders themselves. Hermione sat back in her chair. Her face had the expression of someone whose mind was moving much faster than their face was reporting. Dumbledore doesn't know you found the room, she said. No. If he did know it existed, he's been headmaster for decades, Harry said. He knows the castle better than anyone alive. If the room exists, he knows it exists. And the book? Harry was quiet for a moment. I don't know. The room opens to my touch. I don't know if it opened to him. She absorbed this. We need Andromeda Tonks to have both documents before the session. Already planned. Hedwig goes tomorrow morning. She nodded slowly, then pushed the astronomy essay aside and pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her with the specific purposeful movement of someone setting aside small work for large work. Tell me everything the writ says. All of it. We need to understand the full scope before the session, and we need to be ready for every objection they'll raise, and, she uncapped her ink, we have 3 weeks. 2.5 now, Harry said. She began writing. The library was empty except for them, and the candles were burning low, and outside the windows the autumn night was clear and cold and full of stars, and Harry watched Hermione Granger take notes on a document that was going to change everything and thought that he was, by any measure, extraordinarily lucky in his friends. Dumbledore called Harry to his office on Saturday afternoon. Not via McGonagall or a note, Fawkes arrived at the round table during lunch, landed on the arm of Harry's chair, and looked at him with the liquid amber certainty of a message that didn't need words. Harry finished his lunch, told his friends where he was going, and went upstairs. The office was warm with autumn light and the particular lived-in quality of a space that had been thinking for a very long time. Dumbledore was standing at the window when Harry arrived, looking out at the grounds, and he turned when Harry came in without the usual orchestration of the welcome, just turned and looked at him directly. I know you found the room, Dumbledore said. Harry sat down across from the desk. I know you know. The wards notify me when it's accessed. A pause. In 37 years as headmaster, they have never notified me. It has never opened. He came to his chair and sat, and the movement was slow in the way of someone carrying something heavier than their body. I have walked past that door 800 times, knowing what it was. It did not open for me. What did you know it was? Harry asked. Dumbledore folded his hands. The Founder's inner sanctum. The room of primary documents. I knew the writ existed, I had encountered references to it in 4 historical sources. I knew it contained the operational framework for the heir's authority. A long pause. I did not know Article 9 of the Charter existed until Madame Longbottom included it in her formal petition to the Wizengamot this week. Harry held this. You didn't know Article 9? No. The word was simple and direct and Harry believed it entirely, which complicated things in a different direction than he'd been prepared for. Harry, when I told Neville's grandmother the Charter was a historical curiosity, I believed it. I believed the conditions for its application were so astronomically unlikely that it was, in practical terms, theoretical. I was wrong. He met Harry's eyes without the warmth, without the management, just the bare fact of a brilliant man acknowledging an error. I was profoundly wrong, and the ramifications of that error they are not small. No, Harry agreed. They're not. I need you to know that I did not conceal the charter's full contents from you deliberately. I genuinely did not know its full contents. A pause. I also need you to know that I did intend to manage your understanding of your own situation, and that is a separate error, and a worse one, and I've been sitting with it since the library on Tuesday evening. Harry looked at him for a long moment. The diadem was doing its sharpening thing, and what it was sharpening was not suspicion but clarity, the ability to hold two things simultaneously without one cancelling the other. Dumbledore was telling the truth. And Dumbledore had still planned to manage him. Both were true. Neither excused the other. Neither required the other to be false. The Wizengamot is going to ask whether you suppressed information under Article 9, Harry said. Whether you knew what it said and kept it from me. I know. And the honest answer is that you didn't know Article 9 specifically, but you knew enough about the Charter to advise Neville's grandmother 3 times that it was theoretical, and that advice had the effect of suppression whether or not it was intended. Dumbledore's expression was the most unguarded Harry had seen it, not uncomfortable, not performing, just the face of someone sitting in the full light of a clear and accurate assessment. Yes, he said. That is precisely what the Wizengamot will say. What do you want me to do about it? Nothing, Dumbledore said, and the word surprised Harry enough that he kept his face still by effort. I want you to do nothing. I want you to go to the Wizengamot with the Charter and the Writ and Andromeda Tonks and Augusta Longbottom and let the process function as it should. I will answer for my part in it honestly. He looked at Harry steadily. I am not asking you to protect me, Harry. I am asking you to trust that I know what accountability looks like and am prepared to face it. Harry sat with this for a moment that stretched long enough to be a decision. Will you still advise me? Harry asked. Going in. The 3 Wizengamot members Andromeda Tonks identified as hostile, you know them personally. Something moved across Dumbledore's face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite gratitude but lived in the neighborhood of both. I know all of them personally, he said. Ogden is theatrical but not sincere in his opposition, he wants to appear principled without actually being obstructive. Address him with the historical precedent. He loves history. A pause. Marchbanks has been on the Wizengamot for 60 years and will respect the Writ's language above everything else. She wrote magical education law for a decade and will recognize the quality of the founder's governance thinking. She'll want you to demonstrate understanding of what you're claiming, not just possession of it. And the third? A longer pause. Fudge's man. Morrison. He'll vote as the ministry directs and his objections will be procedural rather than substantive. Andromeda Tonks will eat him alive before he finishes his opening statement. A small pause. She is very good. I know, Harry said. Where did you find her? She wrote to me. Dumbledore's expression did something quiet and private. Of course she did. He rose. Harry, whatever happens at the Wizengamot, the school is yours. Not in the sense of authority, though the Charter establishes that clearly enough. In the sense that it recognizes you. It has recognized you since the moment you arrived, in ways I've never seen it recognize anyone. He looked at his hands on the desk. I built this school into what it is over 37 years, and I am aware that a 1,000-year-old institution's loyalty to an 11-year-old supersedes my 3 decades of tenure without hesitation, and I find, to my own surprise, that I'm not aggrieved by that. Only humbled. Harry stood too. For what it's worth, he said, I think you built it well. The things I want to change, they're not criticisms of what you built. They're just, he searched for the right way to say it, the argument isn't finished. You kept it running for 37 years. I'm supposed to carry it forward. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The Writ says that. The Writ says that. A pause. Then, very quietly, something that was unmistakably, specifically relief, Good. The 2 weeks before the Weisengamot session had a quality of compressed time, each day full and forward-moving, no two the same, the ordinary life of a student running parallel to the extraordinary life of a constitutional event that was gathering momentum in London like weather. Andromeda Tonks visited Hogwarts on the Wednesday of the second week, arriving via flew into McGonagall's office and spending 3 hours with Harry in a conference room that McGonagall provided without comment and with a tray of tea that nobody touched because they were moving too fast. She was a tall woman with dark hair going grey at the temples and eyes that took in everything in a room simultaneously and then organized it while appearing to simply look at you. She reminded Harry of Hermione in 30 years, or Hermione reminded Harry of her in 30 years backward, and he wasn't sure which direction the comparison ran, but it felt accurate. She had annotated the charter and the writ with a thoroughness that suggested she hadn't slept much since receiving them. Her annotations were in 2 colors, red for what was legally unassailable, blue for what would be contested and how to defend the contestation. The pages were almost entirely red. They will try 3 things, she said, sitting across from Harry with her annotated documents spread between them. First, age, that you cannot hold legal authority as a minor. The charter predates the concept of magical legal majority by 9 centuries, and the writ explicitly states that the artifact's choice constitutes majority in matters of stewardship. We answer with that. Harry nodded. Second, continuity, that a title dormant for 1,000 years cannot simply be reinstated without formal process. We answer with Article 7's explicit provision that the artifact's choice is self-executing. No further process is required or contemplated. She turned a page. Third, and this is the one we need to be most careful of, they will argue that even if the charter is valid and the title is real, the ministry retains concurrent jurisdiction over the school under the Education Act of 1694. This is their strongest argument because it's partially correct. Partially, Harry said. The founder's jurisdiction over the school's traditions and governance is exclusive, she said. The ministry's jurisdiction over educational standards is concurrent but subordinate in the event of conflict. I can argue that successfully. What I need from you, she looked at him directly, the way she had throughout the session, the way that said I'm talking to my client, not a child, is for you to demonstrate, when you speak, that you understand what you're claiming. Not the legal argument. The substance. The writ, Harry said. The writ, she confirmed. Carry it to the session. Quote it precisely. The Weisengamot is full of people who have spent their careers with governance documents, and there is nothing they respond to more strongly than someone who has actually read what they're holding. I've read it 20 times, Harry said. She looked at him. I know, she said. It shows in your questions. Hermione, sitting along the wall with her notes, made a small satisfied sound that she converted into a cough when Tonks glanced at her. After the meeting, walking back through the corridors, Hermione said, she said it shows in your questions. You understand what an extraordinary thing that is for a barrister to say. It means she's not worried, Harry said. It means she thinks you're going to win, Hermione said. Harry walked with this thought for a corridor's length. The castle was around him with its familiar warmth, its creaks and shifts, the way the light came differently around different corners. The diadem was clear and steady at his brow. The cup was warm at his side. The sword was a presence at the back of his awareness like a hand on his shoulder. We're going to win, he agreed, and the certainty of it was not arrogance, it was the particular calm of someone who has done the work and knows what the work was worth. That evening he went back to the circular room. He stood at the center with the wall writing around him, the 4 hands of the 4 founders in their continuous argument, and he read for 2 hours. Not looking for anything specific. Just reading. Getting acquainted with the people whose work he was carrying forward. Salazar Slytherin, he found, was the one who had pushed hardest for the heir provision. His argument in the wall's writing was direct and unsentimental. We will disagree always on particulars and some disagreements will outlast us, so we need not agreement preserved but the conditions for argument continued. The heir was the mechanism for continuing the argument. The charter and the writ were not a constitution to be followed but a framework for the conversation to proceed. Harry stood in the circular room and thought about that for a long time. Then he picked up the book and went to find Ron, because he'd been holding serious things in his head for 2 weeks, and sometimes what you needed was someone who would listen to the whole thing and then say something that cut through it sideways. Ron was in the entrance hall, practicing Gob's tones with Neville, and he looked up when Harry arrived and read something in Harry's expression with the ease of someone who had grown up in a large family and had become fluent in people's faces as a basic survival skill. "Tell me," Ron said, and set his Gob's tones aside. Harry sat on the bottom stair. He told Ron about the circular room, about the writ, about Dumbledore's conversation, about Andromeda Tonks and the 3 arguments and the Wizengamot in 5 days. He told it straight through, without organizing it, just in the order it had happened, and Ron listened with the full and undivided attention that was one of his particular gifts, not planning his response while you spoke but actually being present in the story as you told it. When Harry finished, Ron was quiet for a moment. "The thing Slytherin said," Ron said slowly. "About the heir being the conditions for the argument to continue." "Yeah. That's why all 4 of them chose you," Ron said. "Not because you're the best at any of the 4 things. Because you can hold all 4 of them at once without any of them canceling out." Harry looked at him. Ron shrugged. "That's the only way an argument stays alive, isn't it? You need someone who can see every side of it." Neville had been listening quietly from the step below. He said, "My Gran is going to like the writ." "I know," Harry said. "She might actually cry," Neville said. "I've never seen her cry. It might be alarming." "I'll prepare myself," Harry said. Ron picked up his Gob's tones. 5 days, he said. 5 days, Harry agreed. The castle was warm around them, full of the evening sounds of a school at rest, distant music from somewhere in the upper floors, a ghost passing through the wall at the end of the corridor making the usual ethereal complaint about the cold, the smell of dinner still in the air. Harry sat on the bottom stair with the writ in his bag and the charter in his robes and 3 weeks of preparation in his bones, and he thought about the Wizengamot chamber in London, and the faces of the people who would be there, and the words he was going to say, and felt ready, not the performed readiness of someone who needs to look confident, but the real kind. The kind that comes from having done everything you could with the time you had. For days later, the storm that had been building over Britain since a hat sat on an 11-year-old's head in the Great Hall of Hogwarts and refused to say a single house name was finally going to break. Harry was looking forward to it. Chapter 5, Arrest the Headmaster. The Wizengamot chamber was underground. Harry hadn't known that until he stepped out of the Ministry of Magic's golden lift and felt the weight of London pressing down from above. Not oppressively, just presently, the way deep places have presence. The chamber itself was circular, which felt right, and tiered, which felt less right, the rows of seats ascending in a horseshoe around a central floor where a single chair sat under a wash of cold light, the chair where the person being addressed was supposed to sit. Harry didn't sit in it. He stood beside it, hands easy at his sides, the diadem at his brow and the cup in the bag over his shoulder and Andromeda Tonks to his left, and he looked up at the assembled Wizengamot, 52 witches and wizards in plum-colored robes, ranging from Augusta Longbottom who sat third from the left in the front row with the expression of a woman who has arrived exactly on time for something she has been preparing for, to a young-looking wizard in the back row who appeared to be trying to look simultaneously attentive and unremarkable, which was its own kind of performance. Dumbledore was in the public gallery. He had come without robes of office, without his usual orchestration of presence, dressed plainly, sitting alone at the end of a row. He had nodded at Harry when they arrived and Harry had nodded back, and that had been the extent of it, and it was enough. Hermione, Ron, and Neville were in the gallery on the opposite side. Hermione had brought notes. Ron had brought Hermione's backup notes at her request. Neville sat with his grandmother's eyes on him from across the chamber, the two of them exchanging a look that communicated a great deal about their relationship, and all of it was good. Madame Griselda Marchbanks, Chief Warlock, called the session to order with the tap of a wand on the stone railing before her and the particular authority of someone who has been calling things to order since before most people in the room were born. We are convened for a formal hearing regarding the Founders' Charter of 980 AD, she said, specifically the application of Article 7 as pertaining to the individual identified as heir of the Founders. The hearing will address 3 questions. First, the Charter's legal validity and contemporary applicability. Second, the legitimacy of the heir's claim as established by the artifact's response. Third, the scope of authority granted by the Charter and the Founders' Writ as it pertains to the governance of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She looked down at Harry with the sharp attention of someone who had spent 60 years assessing people from this position and had become very good at it. Counsel for the heir. Andromeda Tonks stepped forward. She had worn charcoal grey robes today, which Harry had noticed was the same color as the Wizengamot chamber stone, and he thought that was either coincidence or tactical, and either way it was right. She was perfectly composed and completely dangerous, and the room knew both things within approximately 30 seconds of her opening her mouth. Madam Chief Warlock, members of the Wizengamot, she said, the charter before you is the primary founding legal instrument of Hogwarts School. It predates the Ministry of Magic by over 700 years. It predates the Education Act of 1694 by over 700 years. It predates every piece of legislation the ministry's representatives will cite today by every year of its existence. We are not here to ask you to accept a new precedent. We are here to ask you to recognize an old one, the oldest one in British magical law, that has been waiting for precisely this occasion. She paused, just long enough. The artifacts did not malfunction on the 1st of September. They did not misfire or respond to some ambient condition of the sorting. They made a deliberate, simultaneous, and unambiguous choice. The hat declared it aloud. The artifacts moved of their own will. 300 witnesses observed it. Another pause. The Charter says, when this happens, the heir is recognized. Not debated. Not reviewed. Recognized. She opened the Charter on the table before her. Article 7 is 2 sentences and they are not ambiguous sentences. We will demonstrate that today. She went through the legal argument with the precision of a surgeon, each point placed exactly, each connection drawn clearly, no flourish, no theater, just the clean architecture of a case built from the ground up on unassailable foundations. The ministry's legal team, led by Umbridge, listened with the attentiveness of people planning their angles of attack. Ogden, the theatrical one, leaned forward with the expression of a man who was genuinely interested despite himself. Marchbanks took notes. Morrison, Fudge's man, waited until Andromeda finished and then raised the age argument immediately, as she'd predicted. He was a compact man with a precisely trimmed beard and the voice of someone accustomed to procedural objections, which he delivered with the confidence of a weapon he'd used successfully many times. Andromeda took him apart in 4 sentences. He tried the continuity argument. She disposed of that in 3. When he reached the concurrent jurisdiction argument, he settled in, because this was his actual ground and he knew it, and he laid it out competently. Harry watched Andromeda listen, her expression neutral, and saw the specific quality of stillness in her that meant she was letting him finish not because she needed more time but because interrupting him would have been unkind. When he finished she said, the ministry exercises concurrent jurisdiction over educational standards. It does not exercise jurisdiction over governance structure, founding documents, hereditary title, or the internal legal framework established by the school's creators. These are categorically distinct domains. The writ of the Founders, which I'm now introducing as the second primary document, she placed it beside the Charter on the table, and the whisper that moved through the chamber at its appearance had the quality of people recognizing something they'd only heard about in the same way you recognize someone's face from a description, establishes the heir's operational authority in precisely those domains where the ministry has no standing. Morrison opened his mouth. I haven't finished, she said pleasantly. She introduced the writ with the care of someone handling something that deserved to be handled carefully, quoting specific passages with the ease of someone who had them memorized. When she reached the section on the heir's authority to reform curriculum and governance, a second whisper moved through the chamber, louder this time, with an edge of something that was either excitement or alarm depending on where you were sitting. Marchbanks leaned forward. Counsel. The writ section on governance authority, you're citing this as operative today. Not as historical context. As operative today, Madam Chief Warlock, Andromeda said. The writ's governance provisions activate upon recognition of the heir. If this body recognizes the charter today, the writ is operative as of the 1st of September. The chamber moved in its collective way, a rustle, a shifting, a recalibration of what people had come here to decide. Marchbanks looked at Harry. The heir himself. Does he wish to address the body? Harry stepped forward. He hadn't prepared a speech. Hermione had offered to help him write one and he told her what he wanted to say and she'd written it and it was excellent and he'd read it twice and then set it aside, because the thing about a speech you've written is that it sounds like a speech, and he didn't want to sound like a speech. He wanted to sound like himself, because himself was what he'd be for the next 7 years and potentially longer, and it would be better if the Wisengamot knew what that sounded like from the start. I found the room with the writ at 4 in the morning 2 weeks ago, he said. I woke up and the diadem was doing something that felt like urgency, and I followed it, and a door in the castle's sub-basement opened to my hand. I stood in the room for about an hour reading what the founders wrote on the walls, and then I picked up the writ and went back to bed. He looked up at the tiered rows. 52 pairs of eyes and none of them were what he'd expected, not intimidating exactly, more like a concentrated form of attention, the particular quality of attention that comes from 52 people who are used to assessing things for a living, all doing it simultaneously. I'm 11, he said. I know that's the first thing everyone thinks about when they look at me, so I'll say it before anyone else does. I'm 11 and I'm a first-year student and I want to go to school and do my homework and be ordinary as much as I can be. He held their attention without aggression, without performance. But I'm also, apparently, this. The person the artifacts chose. And I've spent the past 3 weeks trying to understand what that means, not so that I could hold it over anyone, but because it's real and I'd rather understand real things than pretend they aren't. He reached into his bag and set the cup on the table beside the 2 documents. It lit immediately, the warm gold that was its nature, and half the chamber leaned forward slightly in the unconscious response of people drawn to warmth. The writ isn't a power grab, Harry said. I want to be clear about that because I can see it's what some people are worried about. The founders didn't write the writ so that the heir could override everything and run the school unilaterally. They wrote it so that the school would have someone with the standing to protect it when it needed protecting, from external pressure, from institutional drift, from people who meant well but were slowly pointing it in a direction the founders hadn't intended. He paused. I'm not going to rewrite curriculum in my first year. I'm not going to fire professors or reorganize houses or issue decrees. I'm going to go to class and learn transfiguration and probably fail my first potions essay. A very small pause. But if the school needs protecting, I'll do that. That's what the artifacts chose me for. Not power. Stewardship. The last word landed quietly. He'd chosen it because it was the charter's word, because using the charter's own language was both accurate and effective, because Marchbanks had written educational law for a decade and she would recognize the deliberateness. She was watching him with an expression that was very still. Ogden, in the second row, had his chin in his hand and his elbow on the railing and was watching Harry with undisguised fascination. Harry remembered what Dumbledore had said, address him with historical precedent, and said, the last time these artifacts moved was the founding of the school itself. 1,046 years ago. Whatever the Wisengamot decides today, it's deciding something that will be cited in legal scholarship for the next 1,000 years. I think that's worth taking seriously. Ogden straightened up. He looked like a man who had just been addressed specifically and appropriately in his own language. He wrote something on his parchment. Morrison made a final procedural objection about the timing of the writ's introduction, and Andromeda dealt with it with the ease of someone flicking a fly from their sleeve, and then Marchbanks called for questions from the floor. The questions were good. Harry had expected procedural challenges and got substantive ones instead, which told him the serious members of this body had read the documents before arriving and were genuinely engaging with them. He answered each one directly, and when he didn't know something he said so, which appeared to surprise people more than it should have. 3 questions from Augusta Longbottom, each more technical than the last, which Harry answered with the writ specific language because that was what she was testing, not his intelligence but his fluency, his actual familiarity with the document, the difference between having read it and knowing it. He knew it. The last question came from a witch in the middle row who hadn't spoken yet, older, with a face that had the specific quality of someone who had seen a great deal and organized it into patience. She said, "The writ section on governance authority includes a provision about the headmaster's role. Specifically that the headmaster serves at the heir's recognition and can be removed by the heir for cause. Do you intend to invoke that provision with respect to the current headmaster?" The chamber went very quiet. Harry looked at the question directly, because it was the question, the one the whole session had been angling toward, and pretending otherwise would have been insulting. "No," he said. "Dumbledore built something extraordinary. I have issues with specific decisions he made, some of which I think this body is going to want to examine today, but removing him isn't the answer to those issues. Accountability is." The witch in the middle row looked at him. "And who provides that accountability?" "You do," Harry said. "That's what this body is for." The deliberation break was 30 minutes, and Harry spent it in an antechamber with Andromeda Tonks, who was reviewing her notes with the composed focus of someone who had calculated the outcome and was simply waiting for the arithmetic to complete. "You mentioned specific decisions of Dumbledore's that the body should examine," she said, without looking up. "You know what that opens?" "I know," Harry said. "The Article 9 question." "Yes." She looked up then. "He didn't know about Article 9. I believe that. I think the Wisengamot will believe it too." She held his gaze. "But he did advise 3 separate Wisengamot members that the charter was theoretical when he knew it was real. That's not the same as suppression, but it's not nothing, and this body will want to address it." "I know," Harry said again. "So does he." She looked at him with the same expression Marchbanks had been using, the still, assessing look of someone recalibrating what they expected. "You spoke to him?" "He came to me, actually." She set her notes down. "How much does he know about today's proceedings?" "I told him the broad strokes. He knows the writ exists and that it's being presented. He knows Article 9 is going to come up." Harry looked at the closed door of the antechamber, beyond which the Wisengamot was deliberating over everything that had been set before it. He said he'd answer honestly. "You believe him?" "I believe he means to." A pause. "I think he'll find honest harder than he expects, because he's spent decades believing that management and care are the same thing, and untangling them in public is going to be," he searched for the word, "painful. But he'll do it." Andromeda was quiet for a moment. "You're remarkably," she stopped. 11, he suggested. "Measured," she said. "About someone who has affected your life in significant ways." "He's done it because he thought it was right," Harry said. "I can be angry about the outcome without thinking he's a villain." He met her eyes. "He's not a villain. He's a brilliant man who got accustomed to being the smartest person in every room and stopped noticing when that was useful and when it was harmful. That's a very human thing to be." Andromeda Tonks looked at her first-year client for a long moment with an expression that reminded Harry of the way Fawkes had looked at him in the headmaster's office on the first night, the amber-eyed recognition of something worth acknowledging. She said, "Your parents would have been proud of you." Harry had no ready response for that. He took a breath. "Let it settle." "Thank you," he said. The door opened. Marchbanks' clerk appeared. "They're ready." The vote was 41-11 in favor of recognizing the charter's validity and the heir's standing. The 11 dissenters were mostly ministry-aligned, and Morrison's expression when the count was read suggested he was already composing the letter to Fudge, who was in the public gallery and whose face had gone through several shades of politician's calculation during the proceedings. Harry watched Fudge and thought about what Hermione had said, a frightened man with political power, and thought that Fudge's face right now was not the face of a frightened man but the face of a man updating his risk assessment. He was watching Harry with the new attention of someone who has recategorized you. Not as a threat. As a fact. A fact you navigate around rather than through. Harry could work with that. The moment the vote was read, Marchbanks moved immediately to the second business, the Article 9 question, which she introduced herself rather than waiting for either party to raise it, which told Harry something about how she'd spent the deliberation break. The Wisingamot has reviewed the text of Article 9 of the Charter, she said, which establishes that any individual who knowingly conceals, withholds, or misrepresents the existence or substance of the Charter to the detriment of the recognized heir commits an act of treachery against the school and law. Questions have been raised regarding the current headmaster's communications to members of this body regarding the Charter's applicability. She looked at the public gallery. Professor Dumbledore. Would you come forward? The chamber's quality of silence changed. Dumbledore rose from his seat in the gallery and descended to the floor. He wore no robes of office, carried no wand visibly, came to stand in the center of the chamber with his hands at his sides and the complete absence of his usual orchestration, no warmth, no grandfather performance, no managed impression. Just the man, standing in the light. He was, Harry thought, even more extraordinary like this. The dignity was internal. Marchbanks asked him 3 questions. She asked them with the directness of someone who had served on this body for 60 years and had no patience for indirection. First, had he been aware of the Founders' Charter prior to the events of September 1st? Yes. For the entirety of my tenure as headmaster, and for some years prior. Second, had he communicated to members of this body that the Charter was, in his words, a historical curiosity with no contemporary legal applicability? A pause. Yes. On 3 occasions. In written correspondence. Third, at the time of those communications, did he believe that to be true? Another pause. Longer. The chamber held its breath. I believe the conditions for Article 7's application were so unlikely as to be functionally impossible, Dumbledore said. I communicated my assessment in terms that I now recognize were stronger than that assessment warranted. I did not say unlikely. I said theoretical. There is a meaningful difference. He looked at Marchbanks directly. I did not knowingly deceive. But I spoke with a confidence I had not earned, on a matter I had not examined with sufficient rigor, and that confidence influenced the beliefs of individuals who trusted my expertise. I cannot tell this body that the outcome of that was different from suppression, even if the intention was not. The chamber was very still. Article 9 requires intent, Augusta Longbottom said from the front row, not aggressively, precisely. Knowingly. The article requires a finding of knowledge and intent. It does, Marchbanks confirmed. Then Article 9 is not applicable, Augusta said. But the conduct is still subject to formal censure by this body under standard Wisingamot ethics provisions. A pause across the chamber, people absorbing the distinction, the precise legal path between the more serious charge and the less serious one that was still serious. I accept the censure, Dumbledore said. He said it without preface, without qualification, with the straightforwardness of someone who has decided that the cost of this moment is the cost, and the cost is worth it. In full. Whatever form this body determines appropriate. What happened next, Harry had not expected. It was Augusta Longbottom who spoke again, and her voice, when she spoke, had lost its precision, not its control, but the temperature had changed beneath the control, the way a fire changes when you understand what's burning. Albus, she said, first name, not title, the public marker of a shift from formal to human, you advised me, twice, that my grandson's dormant magic was unlikely to develop significantly. You said he might never be a competent wizard. You said it gently. You said it as an expert. The chamber listened. My grandson, Augusta said, repotted a mandrake seedling without gloves 2 weeks ago and the mandrake did not scream. He has been in proximity to the Founder's heir for 3 weeks and his magic has been waking up. Her voice was controlled and the control was costing her something. I understand that your assessment of Neville was not related to the Charter and was perhaps not Article 9's territory. But I want you to understand, she stopped. Restarted. I want you to understand the effect of being told by the most brilliant wizard alive that your grandson is limited. I want you to understand what 37 years of good intentions look like from the other side of them. Dumbledore looked at Augusta Longbottom, and on his face was something that Harry had not seen there before and would not forget, not guilt, which is often self-regarding, but grief, which is about the person you've hurt. Genuine, uncomplicated grief at a specific and named harm. I know, he said. Augusta, I know. I am sorry. A pause. For the specific thing. Not the general category of thing. The specific, Neville. He was never limited. He was frightened, and I chose to counsel caution when I should have counseled courage. That was wrong. In the gallery, Neville was looking at his hands in his lap, and his jaw was set, and whatever he was feeling he was holding it with both hands. Marchbanks called a brief recess. In the corridor outside the chamber, Harry found Neville standing by a stone pillar with his arms folded and his face tilted upward toward the ceiling in the posture of someone managing something large in a small space. Harry stood beside him without saying anything. After a moment, Neville said, "Did you know she was going to say that?" "No," Harry said. "Good." A breath. It's good. That he said it. I just need a minute. Take your time, Harry said. Ron appeared with 3 cups of water from somewhere, which was so perfectly Ron that Harry could have laughed, and handed them out, and the 3 of them stood in the corridor outside the most consequential hearing in British magical law in a generation, drinking water from paper cups, and Neville took his minute, and then they went back inside. The formal censure was issued at 2:30. Dumbledore was to submit a written accounting of all communications in which he had represented the Charter's applicability, to submit to oversight from a Wisingamot-appointed educational auditor for 3 years, and to make a public statement acknowledging the Charter's validity and the heir's standing. The censure was not a removal from office. Marchbanks had been specific about that, and Harry suspected she'd argued for it in the deliberation, because the educational audit was the substantive consequence and removing Dumbledore would have been theatre. As Marchbanks read the terms, Fudge rose from the public gallery. "Madam Chief Warlock," he said, and his voice had the quality of something prepared. He'd spent the recess composing this, Harry could see the rhythm of it. "The Ministry would like to formally request, given the findings today regarding the Headmaster's conduct and the scope of the Charter's authority as now recognized, that the Wisingamot consider a motion of no confidence in the current Headmaster's continued tenure." The chamber went cold. Not with shock. With attention. The specific crystalline attention of 52 people understanding simultaneously that the ground had shifted. Harry stood up. He didn't ask for recognition from the chair. He simply stood, and Marchbanks looked at him, and something in the look said, "I'll hear you," and Harry said, "The motion is premature." Fudge looked at him. "The heir's opinion on Ministry motions. The heir's opinion on Ministry motions regarding Hogwarts Headmaster," Harry said, "is relevant under Article 7. The Headmaster serves at the heir's recognition. That's the writ's language. If anyone has standing to raise a no-confidence motion on the Headmaster's tenure, it's me." He held Fudge's gaze with the steadiness that was not defiance but the simple factual weight of someone who knows their ground. "And I'm not raising it." He accepted censure honestly and without qualification. He acknowledged specific harms. He's agreed to oversight. He looked at the chamber. The writ section on governance says the heir's role is protective, not punitive. Dumbledore made errors. He's being held accountable for them. That's the system working. Removing him now isn't justice, it's politics. Fudge's jaw worked. He was being outmaneuvered by an 11-year-old in the most prestigious legal chamber in British magic, and his face was doing everything it could to not show it. "The Ministry," Umbridge said, smoothly, from her seat beside Fudge. She hadn't been in the gallery as a spectator, Harry realized, she'd been working, has broader concerns about the headmaster's conduct that are not limited to the charter. There are questions about his management of information in several areas of ongoing national magical security concern. She smiled. We would request the session be extended to address those concerns. The session went quiet. Harry looked at Umbridge. She looked back at him with the smile and the cold patient thing beneath it and the name she'd written on her notepad 2 weeks ago, and Harry thought, she'd been building this from the beginning. Not the charter. Not the artifacts. Dumbledore. The charter was the crowbar she'd been waiting for, the mechanism to open the question she'd always been pointing toward. Andromeda Tonks was already on her feet. If the Ministry has allegations of misconduct in matters outside the Charter's scope, those allegations require their own formal hearing with appropriate notice and preparation time for respondents. Raising them in an extended session without notice is procedurally improper and this body should decline. Marchbanks looked at Andromeda. Looked at Umbridge. Looked at Fudge. Looked, finally, at Harry, with the expression of a woman who has spent 60 years watching people use legal process as a weapon and has become expert at identifying the moment it's happening. The Ministry's concerns regarding other matters will be received as a formal submission for a separate hearing, Marchbanks said. The session is not extended. We are concluding today's business. Umbridge's smile did not move. She made a note. As the chamber began to clear, she looked at Harry once, not at the diadem, not at the cup, not with calculation. With the quiet assessment of someone taking the measure of an obstacle and planning the route around it. She held the look for exactly 1 second, then looked away. Harry held the look for 2 seconds, because he wanted her to know he'd noticed. Outside the Ministry, in the grey October afternoon with London moving around them and the magical world folding back under its invisibility, Harry stood on the pavement with Andromeda Tonks and his 3 friends while Neville waited for Augusta to emerge from a conversation she was having with Marchbanks that appeared to involve a lot of parchment, and the day settled into the specific quality of aftermath. Well, Ron said. Well, Harry agreed. The Wizengamot recognized the charter, Hermione said, and she said it the way you say a thing you've been wanting to say for 3 weeks, with the specific relief of someone whose careful work has arrived at its intended result. The writ is operative. The heir's standing is legally established. She paused. That was the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed. You took 16 pages of notes, Ron said. 18, she corrected. The last 2 pages are questions for Andromeda. Andromeda, who had been speaking quietly with a colleague, came back to them with the composed satisfaction of someone who had done their job well and knew it. The formal recognition will be published in the Wizengamot proceedings, she said. The Prophet will have it tomorrow. The Ministry will issue a statement. I'd expect Fudge to get ahead of it by framing it as cooperative. She looked at Harry. The Umbridge question. I know, he said. She's going to file that separate hearing, Andromeda said. And it won't be about the charter. She's been building a case regarding Dumbledore's handling of information about Voldemort's continued existence for some time. The charter gave her the mechanism to force it into the open. She paused. She's not wrong that the question exists. But her reasons for raising it are not good governance. Can you represent Dumbledore for that hearing? Harry asked. Andromeda looked at him. That would require his consent. I'll talk to him, Harry said. You'd advocate for the man who planned to manage you, she said, not a criticism, an observation, the careful note of someone learning who their client was. I'll advocate for the process being fair, Harry said. He deserves a fair hearing. Everyone deserves a fair hearing. Even the people Umbridge uses as vehicles for whatever she's actually after. He looked at the grey London sky above the phone box entrance to the Ministry. What she's actually after isn't Dumbledore. A pause. No, Andromeda agreed. It isn't. Augusta Longbottom emerged from the Ministry entrance with her handbag and her spine and the expression of someone who had just completed a great deal of satisfying work. She found Neville and looked at him for a long moment with the specific intensity of a woman recalibrating everything she'd allowed herself to believe about her grandson, and Neville bore the look with the patient dignity of someone who had been waiting for it and was prepared to receive it fully. She said, "We're going for tea." Neville said, "Okay, Gran." She looked at Harry. Then she extended her hand, which was the gesture she apparently used when words were insufficient, and Harry shook it, and her grip was firm and brief and said everything it needed to. They went for tea, all of them, Andromeda included, and Hermione with her 18 pages of notes, and Ron who ate 4 scones and declared them adequate by Weasley standards which Augusta apparently found entertaining, in a small magical cafe 3 streets from the ministry that existed behind a door that looked like a brick wall and served extraordinary shortbread. Harry sat with his tea and his friends and the warm weight of the day's outcome and let it be good, just for the hour. Let it be the thing it was, a victory, clean and earned, and the school's law restored to something true, and a boy who had spent 11 years in a cupboard under the stairs sitting at a table in a warm cafe with people who'd chosen to be there. Outside, the afternoon was going to grey dusk, and London moved around them in its vast indifferent way, and somewhere in the ministry a woman with a smile that didn't move was writing in her notepad, and the storm that had broken today was already forming its next shape. But that was tomorrow. Today had been won. Chapter 6, The Heir Ascendant. Hogwarts looked different when Harry came back to it. Not physically, the castle was exactly as it had been, the towers catching the late October light the same way they'd caught it the morning he left, the lake flat and pewter grey, the grounds running down to the tree lane with the same indifferent permanence of things that have been in one place for a very long time. But the way Harry saw it had changed, the way your eyes change after you've done something that matters, when the world reconfigures around the event and everything you look at is slightly more itself than it was before. He stood at the top of the path from the carriages for a moment, just a moment, not long enough to be dramatic, and felt the castle recognize him the way it had been recognizing him since the first night, the warmth in the stone and the particular quality of the air around the entrance, the sense of something ancient and enormous giving its full attention to the person standing at its threshold. He went inside. The great hall was between meals, empty except for 2 Hufflepuff 4th years doing homework at their table and nearly headless Nick drifting in a slow philosophical loop near the ceiling. The sword of Gryffindor caught the afternoon light and threw it across the stone in a long bar of gold. Harry set his bag at the round table, sat, and put his hands flat on the surface, and for a moment let himself just be back. Nick drifted downward. "You've been to London," he said, with the tone of someone who had access to the castle's gossip infrastructure and therefore already knew everything. "Wizengamot," Harry confirmed. "I hear it went well." Nick settled into his characteristic hover about 3 feet off the ground, his expression navigating the complicated territory between his inherent theatricality and genuine curiosity. "The castle's been," he searched for the word, "expectant. Since you left. Rather like the night before something." "Something happened," Harry said. "Yes." Nick looked at the sword, at the cup Harry had set on the table, at the diadem at his brow. "The portraits have been talking. Dumbledore's predecessors in the headmaster's office are apparently very engaged." "What are they saying?" Nick assumed an expression of dignified indirection that meant he absolutely knew but was performing reticence. "That things are returning to their proper orientation," he said. "Their words, not mine. Though I'll admit," a pause, the theatricality dropping briefly, "it does feel that way. Rather like a room that's been tilted slightly for years and has finally leveled." Harry looked at the old ghost, dead since 1492, hanging around his school for 5 centuries, watching generations of students move through and move on, and thought about what that much continuity must feel like. Not the loneliness of it. The privilege. Being present for all of it. "Nearly headless Nick," Harry said, "how many headmasters have you served under?" Nick blinked, clearly not expecting this turn. He counted, with genuine effort. 31, he said. "Including the current one. Any of them good?" "Several," Nick said. "Remarkable, a few. Dumbledore," a careful pause, "Dumbledore has been the most extraordinary. Also the most complicated." The most brilliant. And the most, he searched the air for the right word, most convinced of his own correctness, which in his case was usually justified, which is what made the exceptions so consequential. Harry nodded. He's being audited for 3 years. Wisengamot oversight. I know, Nick said. The portraits told me within the hour. He regarded Harry with the specific attention of someone who has been watching things for 500 years and has developed patience as a philosophical stance. What comes next? School, Harry said. I'm going to do school. Nick smiled, the full one, not the performed one. Good, he said, and drifted back toward the ceiling with the quiet approval of someone who had been waiting for exactly that answer. Dumbledore was in his office. Harry had sent a note ahead, a short one, just I'd like to talk when you're back, no rush, and Dumbledore's reply had come on the train home with the same brevity, tonight, if you're not tired. Fawkes will come when I'm ready. Fawkes arrived at 7. The office was warm, more candles than usual, and Dumbledore was standing at the window when Harry came up the stairs, the same position he'd been in for their Saturday conversation, looking at the grounds, and this time when he turned the expression was unguarded in the way it had been at the Wisengamot, the absence of management that Harry was beginning to think was the real face. I want to say something before we discuss anything practical, Dumbledore said. Okay, Harry said, and sat. What you said in that chamber today, about accountability over removal, about the system working, Dumbledore came to his chair and sat, and the movement was slower than usual, the weight of the day in it. I've been in that chamber hundreds of times. I've watched people argue for mercy and against it, watched politics dress itself as principle, watched genuine principle get mistaken for politics. What you did was neither of those things. You were simply right. A pause. It would have been very easy, and very human, to let Fudge's motion stand. I would not have blamed you. I know, Harry said. Which is why it meant something that you didn't. He held Harry's gaze. Thank you. Harry sat with the thanks for a moment, taking it seriously rather than deflecting it. Andromeda Tonks thinks Umbridge is going to file a separate hearing about Voldemort. About what you know about his continued existence and what you've told the Ministry about it. The name landed between them without the usual flinch that accompanied it. Dumbledore had stopped flinching at Voldemort's name before Harry was born, and Harry had never developed the habit. The absence of it made the conversation easier. She's been building toward that question for 2 years, Dumbledore said. The charter gave her the mechanism. He was quiet for a moment. She's not wrong that the question deserves an answer. My concern is not accountability. My concern is who benefits from forcing that particular answer into the public forum at this particular moment. Umbridge, Harry said. Umbridge serves herself primarily and the Ministry secondarily, Dumbledore said, which is occasionally the same direction and occasionally not. What she wants from a hearing about Voldemort is not the truth, she already suspects the truth, but the political leverage that comes from having extracted it publicly. He folded his hands. If she forces a hearing in which I confirm Voldemort's continued existence before the Ministry has any framework for responding to it, the result is not informed public readiness. It's panic. And panic serves Umbridge because panic requires a strong central authority to manage it, and she has, a measured pause, ambitions regarding that authority. Harry looked at him. You've known about her ambitions for a while. Years, Dumbledore confirmed. And you've been managing that too. A pause. This one honest rather than strategic. Yes. Stop, Harry said. Not harshly. The way you say stop to someone doing something that isn't working. I know why you do it. I understand the logic. But you can't manage everything and you've been trying to, and it's made the problems bigger, not smaller, because managed problems don't actually resolve, they just go underground until they can't be contained. He held the old man's gaze. Tell the truth about Voldemort. Publicly, properly, with context, before Umbridge can force it into a forum she controls. Get ahead of it. Dumbledore was very still. You know I'm right, Harry said. I know you're right, Dumbledore said quietly. I have known you're right about this for some time and I have continued choosing management because, he stopped. Started again. Because I am afraid, he said, and the words were clearly the most honest three he'd said in a long time, sitting in the air between them like something raw. Not of Voldemort. Of the chaos that follows truth when the population isn't ready for it. I have spent decades believing it was my responsibility to decide when people were ready. It wasn't, Harry said. It isn't. No, Dumbledore agreed. It wasn't. He looked at his hands on the desk, the ringless, ancient hands of a man who had held extraordinary power for a very long time and was, perhaps for the first time, sitting with the full weight of what power costs. I will speak to the Wizengamot directly. Not through Andromeda Tonks, not with a legal buffer. Directly. He looked up. Before Umbridge files her request. This week, Harry said. This week, Dumbledore confirmed. I'll send a letter tomorrow. The candlelight moved in a draft from the window, and Fawkes shifted on his perch, and somewhere in the portraits behind Harry a sleeping headmaster muttered something in Latin. Harry looked at Dumbledore, at the full measure of him, the extraordinary complicated whole of him, and thought about what the Founder's walls had said. The argument, not the answer. The conditions for the conversation to continue. Dumbledore was part of the argument. He'd always been part of it. He wasn't the ending of something. He was a voice in something ongoing, same as Harry, same as Marchbanks, same as Umbridge in her cold patient way, all of them in the argument, all of them pulling it in their directions, and the school at the center holding everything together until the next generation came to carry it forward. The writ, Harry said. The governance provisions. I want to start actually using them. Not dramatically, I meant what I said in the chamber about not rewriting curriculum in my first year. But there are specific things. Dumbledore gestured, tell me. The point system, Harry said. It's broken. House points create incentives that don't actually map to the school's values, they incentivize point scoring over learning, they create resentment between houses, and the loss of points is used as a disciplinary tool without any principled framework for when it's appropriate. He'd been thinking about this since the first week, since the moment McGonagall had tried to award him points and the hourglass hadn't responded. I want a review. A proper one, with input from students and staff. Not a decree. A process. That, Dumbledore said, is a reasonable and long overdue review. A small pause. I'll be honest, I've known the system had these problems for 20 years. And managed them, Harry said. The ghost of a smile. And managed them, he confirmed. What else? The house system itself, Harry said. Not abolishing it, I understand what the houses mean, the community of them, the tradition. But the way they're implemented makes the school feel like 4 separate schools that share a building and compete for resources. The founders didn't intend competition. They intended complementarity. He touched the writ inside his robes. It's in here. Explicitly. The houses were supposed to cultivate different aspects of the same education, not rank students by sorting them into permanent categories at age 11. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Changing the house system in any significant way, he said carefully, will face opposition from everyone, Harry said. I know. Which is why it's a long project, not a decree. But it starts now. He looked at the old man steadily. I'm not in a hurry. I've got 7 years. And there it was again, the real smile, the small one with nothing behind it except what it was. 7 years, Dumbledore said. Yes. I suppose you do. The prophet ran 2 stories the next morning. The first was the Wizengamot session, Skeeter's byline, though the piece was more restrained than her usual work, as though the actual events had been sufficiently extraordinary to make embellishment feel redundant. The headline read, Founders Heir recognized, ancient charter upheld in historic Wizengamot decision. The subheadline, in smaller type, Dumbledore faces censure, Heir's authority over Hogwarts legally established. The second story ran on page 4, below the fold, a 3-paragraph notice that would have been easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Headmaster Albus Dumbledore has submitted a voluntary statement to the Wisengamot regarding the status of you-know-who, requesting formal session to address the matter with appropriate context. Statement expected to be published within the fortnight. Hermione read page 4 twice. Then she looked at Harry across the round table with the expression of someone updating a calculation whose result was surprising in a good way. "He did it," she said. "He said he would," Harry said. "I know, but," she searched for how to say it without saying I didn't entirely believe him, which was what she meant. "He moved fast." "He decided," Harry said. "Once Dumbledore decides, he moves fast. That's always been true." He reached for his pumpkin juice. The management was the indecision. Once that was gone, he just is what he is, Ron said, arriving with toast and dropping into his chair with the ease of someone for whom this table had become a home. Which is apparently someone who sends letters to the Wisengamot at midnight. Neville appeared, sat, looked at page 4, and said nothing, but his expression said a quiet and private good. The great hall was loud with the morning's news, students reading, discussing, arguing, the natural ecosystem of a school processing information about itself. Harry watched the room and let himself be aware of it, of the 4 tables and their colors and their distinct rhythms, the Slytherin table quieter and more watchful than the others, the Gryffindors already having 3 simultaneous arguments that were probably all about the same thing, the Hufflepuffs discussing it with the inclusive energy that was their particular way of approaching everything, the Ravenclaws already past the emotional response and into the analytical one. All of them his. All 4 of them. Not in the possessive sense, they weren't his to own or direct. But his in the sense of being under his care, all 4 houses, all 4 aspects, the whole complicated breathing organism of the school that the founders had built and the subsequent generations had shaped and which was, right now, on a Tuesday morning in late October, arguing with itself over toast. He loved it. The recognition of that was sudden and specific and absolutely true. Malfoy appeared at his shoulder, not sitting, never quite sitting without the performance of deciding to, but standing at the table's edge with a folded prophet in his hand and an expression that was the most unguarded Harry had seen on him yet. "My father sent me a letter," he said. "About the session." "About you." He set the prophet on the table without unfolding it. "He wants me to, he said I should cultivate the relationship." His words. His mouth twitched with something between distaste and the complicated loyalty of someone who loves a parent they don't agree with. "As though you're a resource to be managed." "I'm not," Harry said. "I know." Malfoy looked at him directly, and for a moment the Malfoy architecture was entirely absent, just a boy his age with grey eyes and a father whose expectations sat on him like a coat 2 sizes too large. "I'm not going to cultivate the relationship. I'm going to," he stopped. "I'm going to talk to you when I have things worth saying. Like I have been." "That works for me," Harry said. "Good." He picked up the prophet. Started to leave. Stopped. "The round table," he said, without turning back. "The founders built it so all 4 sat equally. No head of table." He paused. "Slytherin insisted on it. My father doesn't know that. I thought you might find it interesting." He left. Harry looked at Ron, who raised his eyebrows, and Hermione, who wrote something in the margin of her notes with the expression of someone filing information, and Neville, who watched Malfoy go with the particular attention of someone deciding to revise an opinion they'd held since before they'd actually examined it. The weeks that followed had the quality of a river after a flood, not calm exactly, but moving in its proper banks again, with direction and purpose, the energy that had been scattered by the storm now channeled forward. Harry went to classes. He did his homework, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes adequately, once disastrously in astronomy because he'd been so preoccupied with the Ritz governance sections that he'd mixed up the orbital periods of Jupiter and Saturn, which Hermione corrected with the patience of someone who understood contextual distraction. He learned to fly a broomstick on his first lesson and spent the next 3 evenings in the air because the feeling of it, the clean velocity, the specific freedom of height, was something he hadn't known he needed until it existed. McGonagall watched him fly from the ground on the second evening with her arms folded and the expression she'd been using more and more lately, the one that was controlled wonder with something else beneath it, something that Harry had finally identified as the particular satisfaction of a professor watching a student become what they were capable of, the satisfaction that was the reason people became teachers. She said, "Quidditch tryouts for the house teams are in November." "I don't have a house," Harry said, landing. "No," she agreed. "We'll need to figure something out. Is there a school team? Non-house?" She looked at him. "There hasn't been." "There should be," he said. "For students who want to play without the house competition. Not replacing the house teams, alongside them." She wrote something in the small notebook she carried. "I'll raise it with the staff," she said, and her tone carried the specific quality of "I think this is a good idea and I intend to ensure it happens." The Ritz review process for the point system began in November, a real process, the kind Harry had meant, with input collected from every year group and every house and the entire teaching staff, organized by Hermione with an efficiency that made Percy Weasley look, for the first time, genuinely impressed rather than merely tolerant. The responses came in varied and contradictory and human, and Harry read all of them, and the reading gave him the same thing the Founder's walls had given him, not answers, but the texture of the argument, the real and specific concerns of real and specific people about the place they lived and learned. Snape's response was 2 lines long and said that any review which did not acknowledge the pedagogical function of consequences was sentimentality masquerading as reform, and that sentimentality had no place in educational policy. Harry read it 3 times and kept it on his desk because it was the most useful 2 lines in the entire collection, which he suspected Snape would have found simultaneously gratifying and annoying. Flitwick's response was 4 pages long and contained 7 footnotes and concluded that the point system's fundamental mechanism was sound but its implementation had drifted from its original purpose, and that returning it to that purpose would require clarity about what behavior the school was actually trying to encourage. Harry wrote yes, exactly in the margin. He read them all. Every response from every student. Not because he had to, nobody had required him to, Hermione had offered to compile a summary, but because they were the school talking, and listening to the school talking was his job, and he took his job seriously. Dumbledore's public statement came on a Thursday in November, published simultaneously in the Wisengamot Proceedings and the Daily Prophet as a full-page open letter. It said, in plain language, that Voldemort had not been destroyed on the night of October 31, 1981. That his body had been destroyed but his soul, anchored by dark magic that Dumbledore described in sufficient but not sensational detail, persisted. That Dumbledore believed Voldemort would attempt to return to corporeal form in time. That preparations for this possibility had been underway but had been managed privately in ways that had not adequately served the public's right to that information. That this had been a mistake, and he was correcting it. The letter was precise, calm, and devastating in the way that only truth is devastating, not because of what it contained but because of the contrast it threw against what had been withheld. It acknowledged Harry's name directly. The child known as the boy who lived has a role in the events that I believe are coming, and he deserves to face that role with full knowledge rather than with managed information. I failed him in this respect and I intend to remedy it. Britain did not react calmly. The prophet was full of it for a week. The ministry issued a statement that spent several hundred words saying nothing. Fudge called an emergency press conference and emerged from it looking like a man who had just understood that the ground beneath his carefully maintained position had been shifting for years and was now shifting faster. Umbridge filed her separate hearing request and Marchbanks granted it, and the date was set for January. But here was the thing Harry noticed, watching Britain react from the remove of a castle in Scotland where he was still doing homework and going to Charms and learning to play chess against Ron with the particular futility of someone who understood the theory but not the instinct. The reaction was frightened, but it was real. People were angry, but the anger was directed at the situation, at the fact that it had been hidden, at the genuine threat it represented, not dispersed into confusion and rumor the way it would have been if Umbridge had extracted the information through her hearing, forced and partial and without context. Dumbledore's letter had come with context. With history, with explanation, with the specific acknowledgement that this was being told to them because they deserved to know it. It didn't make the fear smaller. But it made the fear navigable, and navigable fear can be addressed, while unnameable fear only grows. Harry watched this from his turret room at night and thought about the Founder's walls, the argument carried forward, and thought that this was what the argument was about. Not abstract principles. This. The specific, practical difference between telling people the truth and managing their understanding of it. The Hufflepuff truth and the Ravenclaw truth and the Gryffindor truth and the Slytherin truth, all the same truth from 4 different angles. People deserve to know what's real so they can make real choices about it. The Wizengamot formal recognition of the heir was published in mid-November, and with it came something Harry hadn't expected, letters from the other magical schools. Beauxbatons sent a formal communiqué acknowledging the charter's validity under international magical law, signed by Headmistress Maxime with the flourish of someone who had strong opinions about hereditary magical authority and intended them to be visible. Durmstrang's acknowledgement was briefer and more guarded, a single paragraph that said they noted the Wizengamot's decision and would monitor developments with interest, which was approximately the Durmstrang equivalent of enthusiasm. There were 3 others, smaller schools, less well known, and each of them said a version of the same thing, which was "We see you and we're watching." Harry wrote back to each of them. Personally, with his own hand, not through an intermediary. He kept the letters simple. "Thank you for your acknowledgement, I look forward to connections between our schools," but he wrote them himself because the gesture was the point. He was 11 years old and he was corresponding with international magical schools as their institutional equal, and he found this neither overwhelming nor extraordinary after the first 5 minutes. What he found extraordinary, sitting at the round table with the cup casting its warm light on the parchment while he drafted the letter to Beauxbatons, was the moment Hermione sat down across from him, looked at what he was writing, and said, "You're building alliances." "I'm responding to letters," Harry said. "You're building alliances," she repeated, with the satisfied certainty of someone watching a long sequence resolve. "International ones. So that when the Umbridge hearing happens, and when whatever Voldemort's return looks like eventually happens, you're not standing in it alone with just the British Wizengamot behind you." Harry looked at her. She looked back. "Is that what I'm doing?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He thought about it. Then he shrugged. "Good," he said, and went back to the Beauxbatons letter. Ron looked up from his chess game with Neville, which Neville was, for the first time, actually winning, because something in his confidence had changed in the past 2 months and it had found its way into everything he did, including chess strategy. "You know," Ron said, watching Harry write, "when the hat was sitting on your head, I was eating soup. I was literally eating soup while the most important sorting in 1,000 years was happening." "No, you weren't," Neville said. "The food hadn't appeared yet." Ron considered this. "I was waiting for soup." "Same thing." He moved a pawn. "My point is that my soup was delayed by history, and I feel that's worth acknowledging." Harry laughed, genuinely, the full kind, and the sound of it went up into the great hall's enchanted ceiling where a clear November night had replaced the morning's clouds, and the stars were extraordinary. The night before the Umbridge hearing, Harry was in the circular room. He'd been here a dozen times since finding it, reading the walls in sections, understanding the Founders the way you understand people through letters, imperfectly, partially, but genuinely. He knew Gryffindor's handwriting well enough now to feel his temperament in it, the boldness and the impatience. He knew Hufflepuff's careful roundness and the warmth it communicated even in purely functional passages. He knew Ravenclaw's precision and the moments where precision broke open into something that was clearly just wonder, undisguised. He knew Slytherin's narrow elegant letters and the dry humor that ran through his most serious arguments like a seam of something unexpected in stone. Tonight he stood at the center and didn't read. He just stood. The artifacts were with him, diadem at his brow, cup in his hand, the sword's presence in his chest like a compass, the hat somewhere in the castle doing its ancient thing. He stood at the intersection of all four and felt the wheel that the hat had described on the first night, all the spokes, at once, in balance. He thought about tomorrow. Umbridge would be in the chamber, methodical and patient, driving toward whatever position of maximum leverage she'd identified as her goal. He didn't know exactly what she wanted, and he'd stopped trying to predict her precisely because the precision of it was less useful than the broader understanding. She wanted control. She would always want control, and the charter and the writ had permanently removed one category of it from her reach, and that would make her careful and strategic and never directly defeated, just redirected, again and again, by the force of a legal framework that was older and more comprehensive than anything she'd built. He could live with that. That was, in fact, the job. He thought about Dumbledore, who had spent the weeks since the hearing becoming something different in small ways, more direct in his speech, less orchestrated in his manner, occasionally and unexpectedly funny in the specific way of a man who has put down something heavy and found his hands free for the first time in years. He was still extraordinary. He was still the most brilliant wizard alive. He was just now doing it as himself rather than as the role he'd built around himself, and the difference was, as Harry had suspected, significant. He thought about Hermione with her 18 pages of notes and her clear moral seriousness and her developing understanding that justice wasn't a system you obeyed but an outcome you built, actively, every time, from the material at hand. About Ron with his instincts and his loyalty and the way he'd handed Neville chess victories and toast and water in paper cups and never once made any of it about himself. About Neville, whose magic was waking up like a winter garden in unexpected warm weather, who had recently repotted an entire bench of mandrakes without gloves and not lost a finger, who had told Harry quietly one evening that he'd written to his mother at St. Mungo's even though she wouldn't understand the letter, because she was still his mother and she deserved to know what her son was becoming. Harry stood in the circular room with all four artifacts and all four houses and all four founders' voices in the walls around him and the school breathing in the dark above him, and he thought, I'm supposed to carry the argument forward. Not win it. Carry it. The walls glowed very gently, not at his direction, just the ambient light of old magic in a space that recognized itself being understood, and Harry stood in it and let himself be, for a moment, exactly what he was. 11 years old. An orphan. A first-year student. A boy who wanted to go to school and eat his toast in peace and learn everything and be fair. And also, simultaneously, without contradiction, the heir of the founders of Hogwarts. Holder of the ancient charter. Bearer of the artifacts chosen. The continuation of an argument that had been running for 1,000 years and which was going to run for 1,000 more. Both of those things. The same person. Neither cancelling the other. He understood, finally and completely, why all four had chosen him. Not because he was the most powerful or the most brilliant or the most brave. Because he was the one who could hold the whole argument at once, who could care about the small things and the enormous things simultaneously, who could sit with Neville talking about plants and then stand in the Wisengamot and name the precise legal distinction between suppression and negligence, who could eat breakfast and correspond with international schools and argue with Dumbledore and hand the charter to the ministry and laugh at Ron's chess commentary, all of it connected, all of it. The same job, all of it him. He turned one more time, slowly, reading the walls. The last line of Salazar Slytherin's writing, in the section Harry had reached tonight for the first time, said, "The one who carries this forward will be better than any of us alone. They will have to be. We argued too much and built too little. They will know how to build while arguing. That is why we are leaving this for them and not keeping it ourselves." Harry read it twice. "I'll do my best," he said aloud. The walls glowed. He went upstairs. The morning of the Umbridge hearing was cold and clear, the November sky the specific shade of blue that only appears when the air has been scrubbed clean by frost and wind, and Harry came down to the great hall early to find that someone had put a fire in the round table's vicinity, not a fireplace, just a warmth. The castle's own ambient warmth gathered and directed with the small unconscious precision that the castle did when it was paying attention to someone. Hermione arrived first, with her notes and her breakfast, and sat across from him without speaking for long enough that he knew she was organizing something and didn't want to interrupt her own process. Ron came next, hair still chaotic from sleep, carrying his own breakfast and Hermione's forgotten fork that she'd left on the counter. Neville came last, with his herbology journal and a small green plant in a pot that he'd been carrying around for a week because it was in a transitional growth phase and needed monitoring. They ate together in the early quiet of the hall. Outside the windows the grounds were frost-white and the lake was absolutely still and the trees at the forest's edge were bare and stark and beautiful. "Ready?" Hermione asked. "Yes," Harry said. "All four of us this time," Ron said. "In the chamber. Augusta got us seats." "I know." Harry looked around the table at his friends, really looked at them, in the way he'd been learning to look at things, fully, with the complete attention the diadem sharpened and the cup's warmth made patient. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it. Not just today." Ron pointed his fork at Harry. "Eat your eggs first. Be grateful later." Hermione smiled despite herself. Neville's plant leaned very slightly toward the center of the table, which was what it did when it was content, which was Neville's primary metric for a good morning. Harry ate his eggs. In the headmaster's office, Fawkes was singing, not the private note he'd given Harry on the first night, but properly, full and rising, the phoenix song that the castle carried in its stones and always would, the sound of something that burned down to ash and came back because it chose to, because that was its nature, because some things ended only in order to begin again. Harry heard it from the great hall, faint and certain, the way you hear something true from a distance, not clearly enough to transcribe, but clearly enough to know it for what it was. He finished his breakfast. He stood. Picked up his bag. The sword caught the morning light and threw it gold across the stone. "Come on then," he said. They went.